Staff Sergeant Dale Briggs slammed his fist on the mess table so hard the metal trays jumped, and he pointed straight at the new arrival standing in the doorway with her rifle case still slung over her shoulder. "You've got to be kidding me," he barked loud enough for the whole tent to hear. "They sent us a girl to do a sniper's job. Somebody tell me this is a joke." The room went dead silent, 40 pairs of eyes swinging toward her, waiting to see if she would break. Before we go further, if stories about quiet strength, hidden battles, and the kind of justice that makes your chest tighten speak to you, hit that subscribe button and stay with me until the very end. And I'd love to know, drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from tonight. I read every single one, and it means the world to see how far this story has traveled. The helicopter's rotor wash was still kicking dust across the landing zone when Sergeant Ava Mitchell stepped down onto the gravel, and for one long moment, nobody moved to greet her. She stood there with her rifle case in one hand and a duffel bag slung over her shoulder, scanning the perimeter with eyes that had already cataloged 3 sight lines, 2 blind spots, and a gap in the fence line before her boots had even settled into the dirt. Nobody had told her the welcome would be like this. Nobody ever did. A young private near the fuel drums elbowed his buddy and whispered something that made the other one snort. Ava didn't turn her head. She had heard worse in places that weren't nearly this friendly. She kept walking, boots crunching steady rhythm against gravel, toward the cluster of tents that made up the forward operating base's command area. And that was when Staff Sergeant Dale Briggs came striding out of the mess tent like he owned the entire mountain range. He was a big man, thick through the shoulders, with the kind of sunburned face that came from years of pretending the desert didn't bother him. He stopped 10 feet from her, hands on his hips, and let his eyes crawl over her the way a man sizes up a used truck he already plans to reject. "Well, would you look at this?" Briggs said loud enough that heads turned from 3 different directions. "Command sent us a sniper. A real sniper, and it's a girl." A ripple of laughter came from somewhere behind him, nervous and testing, waiting to see if it was safe to laugh harder. Ava set her rifle case down slowly, carefully, the way a person sets down something they've trusted with their life more times than they could count. She looked at Briggs, and her voice when it came was flat and even without a trace of anger in it. "Sergeant Ava Mitchell, reporting as ordered." "Reporting as ordered," Briggs repeated, mocking the cadence of it, turning to his audience like a comedian working a crowd. "You hear that? She's very polite, very professional." He turned back to her, and his smile had teeth in it now. "You know what we do out here, sweetheart? We don't do polite. We do work. Real work. Not whatever they trained you to do at some cushy stateside range." "I've done the work," Ava said. "Sure you have." Briggs stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the stale coffee on his breath. "Let me guess. Paper targets. Maybe a qualification course. Maybe they even let you shoot at a silhouette that doesn't shoot back." He laughed at his own joke, and a few of the men around him laughed too, though Corporal Ethan Brooks, standing near the supply tent, did not. He was watching her face, and what he noticed was that nothing moved in it. Not a flicker, not a flinch. It was like throwing rocks at a wall and waiting for the wall to apologize. "Sir," Ava said, "where do I report for my equipment check?" Briggs blinked, thrown for half a second by the fact that she hadn't taken the bait, and then he recovered, jabbing a finger toward the supply tent. "Brooks'll show you. Brooks, get the girl squared away, and somebody find her a rifle she can actually lift." More laughter. Ava picked her case back up, slung her duffel higher on her shoulder, and walked past him without another word. Briggs watched her go, and something in his jaw tightened, because for a man who had spent 15 years learning exactly how to needle a person until they cracked, walking away without a reaction from her felt like losing, even though he couldn't have said why. Inside the supply tent, Ethan Brooks pulled out a clipboard and started running through the standard gear check, his voice a little too fast, a little too eager to fill the silence. "Don't mind Briggs," he said. "He's like that with everybody at first." "Is he?" Ava said. It wasn't really a question. "Well, not exactly like that, but close." Ethan glanced up from the clipboard. "You're really a sniper, like official?" "I'm really a sniper," Ava said, unzipping her rifle case and beginning the methodical process of checking her weapon piece by piece, the way she had done 10,000 times before in places colder and hotter and more dangerous than this one. Her hands moved with a precision that made Ethan stop pretending to read the clipboard and just watch instead. "Where were you before this?" he asked. Ava's hands paused for half a second on the bolt of her rifle. Just half a second. Then they kept moving. Around, she said. Ethan wanted to ask more, but something about the way she'd said that one word told him not to. He'd been in the Marines for 4 years, long enough to recognize the particular silence of someone who had seen things they didn't talk about. He'd seen it in older sergeants' men twice her age with twice the scars. He had never expected to see it in someone who looked like she'd just walked out of a recruiting poster. That night in the command tent, Captain Ryan Foster sat across a folding table from Ava, with a stack of maps between them running through the operational briefing that command had sent down. He was a careful man, the kind who chose his words before he spoke them, and he'd read her file twice before she'd even landed. There were details in that file that didn't add up to the picture Briggs was painting to anyone who'd listen. "You've got questions," Foster said, watching her study the terrain map. "A few." "Go ahead." Ava's finger traced a ridgeline on the map, tapping twice at a spot near a narrow valley pass. "This corridor. Who controls the high ground on the eastern face?" Foster frowned slightly, checking his own notes. "We haven't had confirmed activity there in 6 weeks." "That's not what I asked." Foster looked up at her, and for the first time since she'd arrived, someone on this base looked at Ava Mitchell like she might actually know something he didn't. "Nobody controls it," he admitted. "It's considered low priority." "It's not low priority," Ava said quietly. "It's the perfect place for someone patient to wait." Foster set down his pen. Outside the tent, he could hear Briggs' voice carrying across camp, telling some joke to a cluster of Marines, the punchline drawing a wave of laughter that felt very far away from the quiet intensity radiating off the woman sitting across from him. He had a strange prickling feeling, the kind soldiers learned not to ignore, that this posting was not what anyone on this base had been told it was. "Where did you learn to read terrain like that?" he asked. Ava didn't answer right away. She looked down at the map, at the ridgeline, at the narrow valley that something in her gut told her was going to matter before this deployment was over. "Experience," she said finally. It wasn't an answer, not really, but Foster didn't push. He had learned a long time ago that some soldiers carried their history like a locked box, and the ones worth trusting were usually the ones who never tried to show you what was inside. The next morning, breakfast in the mess tent started the way it always did. Trays clattering, coffee, too weak. Complaints about the weather. Ava sat alone at the end of a long table eating without looking up, and that was when Briggs decided the silence had gone on long enough. "So," he said, dropping into the seat across from her, uninvited, loud enough that conversation at nearby tables quieted to listen. "I did some digging, asked around. You know what's funny? Nobody's ever heard of your old unit." Ava kept eating. "That's strange, right?" Briggs pressed, leaning forward. "A real operator, someone with real kills, people talk about that. Word travels. But you, nothing. Just a name and a transfer order that showed up out of nowhere." He smiled, but there was something colder underneath it now. Something testing for a weak spot. Makes a man wonder what really happened to your last team. Maybe you're not as good as your file says. Maybe you're the only one who made it back. And maybe that's not because you're skilled. Maybe that's because you let them go first. The mess tent went still. Even the men who'd been laughing at Briggs' jokes a moment ago now sat frozen forks halfway to their mouths, sensing that he had crossed a line that couldn't be laughed off. Ava set down her fork. She looked up at Briggs, and for the first time since she'd arrived, something moved behind her eyes. Something old and heavy and controlled, with an effort that made the hair on Ethan Brooks' arms stand up 3 seats away. "I have buried better men than you," Ava said, her voice quiet, even absolutely certain. "Men who never once needed to make a woman feel small to feel large themselves. So be careful, Staff Sergeant. You have no idea what you're talking to." Nobody laughed. Briggs opened his mouth to fire back some retort already halfway formed, but nothing came out. He looked around the table, searching for the easy laughter that usually rescued him, and found none. Just Marines staring down at their trays, suddenly very interested in food they weren't eating, and Ethan Brooks staring at Ava like he was seeing her clearly for the very first time. Briggs stood up so fast his chair scraped hard against the floor. "Whatever," he muttered, and stalked out of the tent, but the confidence in his walk wasn't quite what it had been when he walked in. Ava went back to her breakfast like nothing had happened at all, but something had happened. Something had shifted in the air of that mess tent, subtle but undeniable, the way a room changes when everyone in it suddenly understands they've misjudged the quietest person in the building. Over the following days, Ava said little, but she watched everything. She walked the perimeter twice each morning before anyone else was awake, memorizing sight lines, noting where the guard rotations left gaps, marking, in a small notebook, the places where the fence line sagged low enough for a determined man to cross unseen. She studied the patrol schedules pinned to the command tent wall and noticed within a day that the Tuesday afternoon rotation left the northern watchtower unmanned for 11 full minutes while the shift changed. She brought this to Foster on the third day. 11 minutes, she said, sliding a hand-drawn diagram across his desk. Every Tuesday, same gap, same time, because your watch schedule rotates on a fixed clock instead of a randomized one. Foster studied the diagram, then looked up at her with an expression somewhere between impressed and unsettled. How long did it take you to notice that one day? Nobody's flagged that in 6 months. Nobody's been looking, Ava said simply. Foster changed the rotation schedule that afternoon quietly without explaining to anyone why, and if Briggs noticed the change, he said nothing about it because saying something would have meant admitting a woman he'd mocked in front of the entire base had found a hole in base security that an entire chain of command had missed. It was around this time that Ethan Brooks started finding excuses to walk with Ava during her morning perimeter checks. At first, he told himself it was because Foster had assigned him as her liaison, and it was simply part of the job. But by the fourth morning, he knew that wasn't the whole truth. He was fascinated by her in the way a person becomes fascinated by something they don't understand and desperately want to. "Can I ask you something?" he said, matching her pace along the fence line, the sun barely up the air, still cool enough to see their breath. "You can ask. Briggs said something the other day about your old unit, about you being the only one who made it back." Ethan hesitated. "Is that true?" Ava's eyes stayed fixed on the tree line in the distance, always scanning. "Some of it." "Which part?" She was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Ethan thought she wasn't going to answer at all. "I was the only one who made it back," she said finally. "That part's true. Whether it was because I let them go first like he suggested." Her voice hardened just slightly, just enough for Ethan to hear the old wound underneath it. "That part is a lie that only a man who's never buried a friend could say out loud." "I'm sorry," Ethan said quietly. "He shouldn't have said that." "No," Ava agreed. "He shouldn't have, but he did, and now I know exactly what kind of man he is, and that's useful information." "Useful how?" Ava finally looked at him, and there was something almost gentle in her expression. A crack in the armor she kept around everyone else. In this line of work, Corporal knowing who breaks under pressure and who doesn't can be the difference between a mission that succeeds and one that gets people killed. Briggs breaks. He breaks in small ways now with words, because words are the only weapon he's ever really needed. But under real pressure, real fire. A man like that either rises to something he didn't know he had, or he collapses completely. I don't know which one he'll be yet. I hope I never have to find out. Ethan didn't have a response to that. He just walked beside her in silence, feeling for the first time since she'd arrived like he understood a fraction of what everyone else on this base was too blind or too proud to see. Word got around, as it always does on a small base, that Ava had once again outmaneuvered expectations, this time by catching a security flaw nobody else had noticed in 6 months. It didn't stop the whispers entirely. Briggs still muttered under his breath when she walked past, still made comments to the newer privates about how command was getting soft-filling billets with anyone who could pass a fitness test, regardless of what was between their legs. But the laughter that used to follow his jokes came slower now. Thinner, like people were starting to feel the discomfort of being complicit in something they weren't sure was fair anymore. Then came the day of the range demonstration. It hadn't been planned as a spectacle. Command had simply scheduled a routine long-range qualification exercise, a chance for the base's designated marksmen to confirm their zero and demonstrate proficiency at extended distances, a formality that happened every few months, regardless of who was posted where. But somehow word had spread that Ava would be shooting, and by the time she arrived at the range with her rifle case, nearly the entire base had found some excuse to be nearby. Briggs was there too, arms crossed, leaning against a support post with a smirk already fixed on his face, clearly expecting to enjoy himself. "This ought to be good," he said to the Marine beside him, just loud enough for Ava to hear as she walked past. "Let's see if she can even hit the berm." Ava said nothing. She set her case down at the firing line, opened it with the same unhurried precision she brought to everything, and began assembling her rifle piece by piece while a range safety officer called out the first target distance. 300 meters. Ava settled into position, adjusting her stance with small economical movements, her breathing already slowing into the rhythm that had kept her alive through things she never talked about. She sighted through her scope, held for a fraction of a second longer than most shooters would have needed, and squeezed the trigger. The crack of the rifle echoed off the surrounding hills. Downrange, the spotter's radio crackled. Center mass. Dead center. A murmur ran through the crowd of onlookers. Briggs's smirk flickered but held. 500 meters, the range officers called. Ava adjusted, calculating windage and elevation in her head with the same casual ease most people used to check the time. She fired again. Center strike. Confirmed. The murmur grew louder. A few Marines who'd been quietly betting against her under their breath started exchanging uncertain glances. 700 meters, the range officer called. Crosswind at 12 miles per hour, gusting. This was the distance where most shooters on the base struggled, where wind became a variable that separated adequate marksmen from exceptional ones. Ava took her time now, watching the grass in the distance bend and settle, reading the wind the way another person might read a familiar face. She made her adjustment, held her breath, and fired. Silence stretched for 3 full seconds before the spotter's voice crackled through, and this time there was something different in his tone, something like disbelief. Wind-adjusted hit. Dead center. That's a hell of a shot. The crowd had gone quiet now, entirely quiet. The kind of silence that comes when people realize they are witnessing something they will talk about for years afterward. Even Briggs had uncrossed his arms. 850 meters. The range officer called, his voice noticeably more respectful than it had been 15 minutes earlier. This was beyond standard qualification distance. This was the kind of shot that separated ordinary snipers from the handful of operators whose names got passed quietly between units, spoken with a kind of reverence usually reserved for legends. Ava took longer this time, much longer, her entire body settling into a stillness that seemed almost inhuman. Her breathing slowing to the point where Ethan Brooks, watching from 20 feet away, found himself holding his own breath in sympathy. Then she fired. The delay before the spotter's report felt like it stretched into forever, and when it came, the words landed on the crowd like a physical weight. Confirmed elimination hit. 850 meters. That is an extreme long-range confirmed strike. Nobody spoke. Nobody clapped. There was no laughter left in anyone's throat, no room for it, because what they had just watched didn't fit into the story. Most of them had been telling themselves about the woman who'd arrived on that helicopter, looking like she didn't belong. Ava rose from her firing position, slowly, methodically breaking down her rifle with the same unhurried calm she brought to everything, as though she hadn't just done something that most Marines on this base would remember for the rest of their careers. Briggs was already walking away. He didn't wait for the final confirmation to be announced. He didn't stay to offer some grudging acknowledgement, didn't stay to save face with a joke about beginner's luck. He simply turned and walked back toward the barracks, shoulders hunched, because somewhere in the last 20 minutes, he had understood something he wasn't ready to say out loud. He had misjudged this woman completely from the very first moment she stepped off that helicopter. And there was no version of pride that could survive admitting that in front of the entire base. Ethan caught up to Ava as she packed her rifle case, his expression somewhere between awe and something that looked almost like fear. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" he asked quietly. Ava zipped her case shut, the sound final, imprecise. "The same place I learned everything else, Corporal. Somewhere I don't talk about doing things I don't talk about for reasons that are none of anyone's business until they need to be." "That's not an answer." "No," Ava agreed, standing and slinging the case over her shoulder. "It's not." She walked away from the range without looking back at the crowd still standing there in stunned silence, without acknowledging the way Captain Foster stood off to the side with his arms crossed, studying her with an expression that had shifted from professional curiosity into something closer to certainty. He had suspected something about her file from the moment he'd read it. Now he was almost sure. That night, Foster sat alone in the command tent long after the rest of the base had gone quiet, a single lantern burning over a file spread across his desk, a file that had arrived with her transfer orders but contained far less information than a file for a Marine of her apparent skill should have contained. Redacted lines, missing unit designations, a gap of 18 months where her service record simply went dark. He picked up the radio handset, hesitated, then set it back down. Not yet, he thought. Whatever this was, whatever she really was, it wasn't the time to ask the questions burning in the back of his mind. Not until he understood what kind of storm might be following her onto this base. Outside in the darkness beyond the perimeter fence in the hills that Ava had spent her first days quietly mapping and memorizing, something was moving that no patrol schedule, no watchtower, no 6-month pattern of no confirmed activity had accounted for. It moved slowly, patiently, the way something moves when it has been waiting a very long time for the right moment, and it was moving toward the narrow valley pass that Ava had pointed to on Foster's map on her very first night at the base. 2 days later, the base received orders for a routine medical supply convoy scheduled to move through that same valley corridor within the week. Standard Intelligence rated the road as moderate risk, nothing unusual, nothing that hadn't been run a dozen times before without incident. Ava read the mission briefing twice, then a third time, and something cold settled into her stomach. The same feeling she'd had exactly twice before in her life, both times right before everything went wrong. She found Foster at the command tent that evening, the briefing paper still in her hand. "This route," she said, "I don't like it." Foster looked up from his desk, tired, the weight of command visible in the lines around his eyes. "It's been cleared. Same corridor we've used for 3 months." "The corridor's the same," Ava said, "but something about it has changed. I can't tell you exactly what yet. I just know that when everything looks the same as it always has and something in your gut says it isn't, you're usually right, and by the time you find out why, it's already too late to matter." Foster set down his pen, studying her with an intensity that hadn't been there when she'd first arrived. "You've felt this before?" "Twice," Ava said quietly. "Both times I was right. Both times nobody listened until it was too late." The tent fell into a heavy silence, the kind that presses down on a room and makes the air feel thicker than it should. "I'll flag it for additional reconnaissance," Foster said finally. "But I can't cancel a supply run on instinct alone, Sergeant. Command needs more than a feeling." "I understand," Ava said, though something in her voice suggested she understood far better than Foster wanted her to understood the particular tragedy of being right about danger and still not being believed until the danger had already arrived. She left the command tent and walked out toward the perimeter fence, staring into the darkness where the valley pass lay hidden beyond the hills. And for a long time, she simply stood there, still and silent, the way a hunter stands when they can feel something watching them back. Behind her, unseen in the shadow of the supply tent, Staff Sergeant Dale Briggs stood with a satellite phone pressed to his ear, his voice low, urgent, speaking words that no one on this base was supposed to hear. "She's asking questions," he murmured into the phone. "About the valley, about the corridor. I don't know how, but she knows something's wrong." There was a pause, a voice on the other end that Briggs listened to with his jaw tightening. "No," he said finally. "I'll handle it. She's just a sniper. She doesn't know anything, not yet." He ended the call and slipped the phone into his jacket, glancing once toward the perimeter fence where Ava still stood, watching the darkness, with an intensity that made him suddenly deeply uneasy. For the first time since she'd arrived, Dale Briggs was no longer sure he was the one holding the power in this camp. And somewhere out beyond the wire in the hills surrounding that quiet, patient valley, the thing that Ava's instincts had been screaming about since her very first night on this base was already moving into position, waiting for the moment when the supply convoy would roll unknowingly into a trap that had been built not by chance but by someone who already knew exactly which route it would take, exactly when it would leave, and exactly who among the men guarding it could be trusted to look the other way at precisely the right moment. The morning of the convoy's scheduled departure arrived with a sky the color of dull steel, low clouds pressing down over the mountains in a way that made even the most experienced Marines on base feel a low, wordless unease they couldn't quite explain. Ava was awake before dawn, as always, walking her perimeter check, with a rifle slung across her back and a notebook of observations that had grown thicker every day since her arrival. She found Ethan already awake near the vehicle staging area, checking equipment with the kind of nervous energy that told her his instincts too were picking up on something. "You feel it too," she said, not a question. Ethan looked up at her, and for once, he didn't try to hide behind casual conversation. "I don't know what I feel. Just wrong. Like the whole camp's holding its breath." "Good," Ava said. "Trust that feeling. Most people spend their whole lives training themselves out of it, and then they wonder why they never see danger coming until it's standing right in front of them." Are you going out with the convoy? Ava's eyes drifted toward the valley pass in the distance, barely visible through the low clouds. I asked Foster for overwatch position on the eastern ridge. He hasn't approved it yet. Why not? Because approving it means admitting he believes me, Ava said. And believing me means questioning intelligence reports that a lot of people up the chain have already signed off on. That's not an easy thing for a career officer to do on instinct alone. Ethan glanced toward the command tent. What if you're right and he doesn't approve it in time? Ava's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes went very still, very cold. The look of someone who had lived through the answer to that exact question before and had buried people because of it. Then I go anyway, she said quietly, approved or not. At that moment, Captain Foster emerged from the command tent, his face drawn tight with the particular exhaustion of a man who had spent the entire night weighing instinct against protocol, gut feeling against chain of command, and had finally reluctantly arrived at a decision. Mitchell, he called out, crossing the yard toward Arrow. You've got your overwatch position. Eastern Ridge like you asked. But the convoy moves on a schedule. I can't hold it any longer than I already have, without a concrete reason command will accept. Relief and dread mixed together in Ava's chest in equal measure. It wasn't everything she wanted, but it was something. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me yet, Foster said grimly. If you're wrong, I've just wasted resources and pulled a Marine off a supply mission for nothing. And if you're right, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Ava was already moving, slinging her rifle case over her shoulder, her mind narrowing into the focused, quiet calm that came before every mission she'd ever run, the calm that had kept her alive when everyone around her had not been so fortunate. As she moved toward the vehicle that would carry her toward the eastern ridge, Briggs stepped into her path, arms crossed, his expression unreadable, in a way that was entirely new for him. Heading out, he asked. Overwatch position, Ava said, moving to step around him. Briggs shifted just enough to block her path again, and for a moment something flickered behind his eyes, something that looked almost like a warning, or perhaps a plea, though Ava couldn't tell which. Be careful out there, he said, and there was none of his usual mockery in it, none of the sneering condescension that had defined every previous word he'd spoken to her. That valley's, it's not what people think it is. Ava studied him for a long moment, and something cold and certain settled into her chest. What do you know, Briggs? His jaw tightened. I don't know anything he said, but his voice cracked just slightly on the last word. And Ava had spent enough years reading men who were lying to know the difference between a man who genuinely knew nothing and a man who was desperately hoping he wouldn't have to know anything more than he already did. If you know something, Ava said quietly, and Marines died today because you didn't say it, that's a weight you'll carry for the rest of your life. I promise you that. Briggs said nothing. He simply stepped aside and let her pass, and as she climbed into the vehicle that would take her toward the eastern ridge, she glanced back once and saw him standing there in the gray morning light, his hand drifting unconsciously toward the pocket where, unbeknownst to her, a satellite phone sat heavy with secrets he hadn't yet found the courage to confess. The vehicle wound its way up a narrow access trail toward the eastern ridge overlooking the valley pass, and Ava spent the ride in complete silence, her mind running through terrain angles, firing positions, escape routes, every scenario her years of experience could conjure. When the vehicle finally stopped near the ridge crest, she moved out on foot, covering the remaining distance alone, low and quiet, the way she had learned to move in places where being seen meant being dead. She reached her chosen position just as the first gray light of morning began to strengthen into something closer to true dawn, and she settled into a shooting position with a clear line down into the valley pass below, checking her rifle, checking her spotting scope, checking the wind, checking everything twice. Because in her experience, the things you didn't check twice were always the things that killed you. Through her scope, she began scanning the ridgelines on the opposite side of the valley methodically, patiently, the way she had scanned 100 valleys before this one in places she still couldn't talk about. And then she saw it. A glint, small, barely there, the kind of thing that 99 people out of 100 would dismiss as sunlight catching a rock or a piece of broken glass. But Ava was the 100th person, the one trained to know that glass didn't sit at that precise angle, that rocks didn't catch light in that particular rhythmic pattern that suggested slow, deliberate movement behind an optic. Her blood went cold. She keyed her knee, her voice low and urgent. Foster, this is Mitchell. I have a visual on possible enemy positioning Eastern Ridge, opposite side of the Valley Pass. Repeat, I have visual confirmation of hostile activity. The convoy needs to hold position immediately. There was a burst of static, and then Foster's voice came through tense. Mitchell, the convoy is already moving. They're 4 minutes out from your position. Ava's stomach dropped. Hold them, she said, her voice sharpening with an urgency she rarely allowed herself. Foster, hold them now. This isn't moderate risk. This is a kill box. I count at least 3 elevated positions, and I haven't finished scanning yet. I'm trying. Foster's voice crackled back, strained. Command link is degraded. I'm getting partial transmission. Say again your last. The radio cut to static. Ava's heart pounded against her ribs as she swung her scope back down toward the valley floor. Watching the first vehicles of the convoy roll into view, at the mouth of the pass, completely unaware of what was waiting for them in the hills above. No, she whispered. No, no, no. She keyed the radio again, screaming into it, now all pretense of calm, professional distance gone. Convoy, this is Mitchell Overwatch position. You are rolling into an ambush. Get out now, I say again. Ambush, ambush, ambush. The message was still leaving her mouth when the first explosion tore through the lead vehicle in the convoy below, a fireball erupting against the gray morning sky. The sound of it reaching Ava's ridge a full second after the light. And in that terrible gap between seeing and hearing, Ava Mitchell understood with absolute bone-deep certainty that everything she had feared since her very first night on this base had just become real. The valley below erupted into chaos. Gunfire opened up from multiple elevated positions, simultaneously raking down into the convoy with brutal coordinated precision that told Ava this was not some opportunistic ambush, but something planned, rehearsed, executed by people who had known exactly where the vehicles would be and exactly when. Through her scope, she could see Marines diving for cover behind burning vehicles, could see Ethan Brooks. Ethan, who had checked equipment beside her just an hour ago, scrambling toward a ditch as the rounds kicked up dirt around his boots. Ava's training took over completely. The fear and the horror pushed down into some locked compartment she would deal with later, if there was a later. Her breathing slowed, her hands went still. The world narrowed down to crosshairs and distance and when the same terrible calm that had carried her through the worst days of her life. She found the first muzzle flash, a sniper position tucked into rocks on the far ridge, and without hesitation, she fired. The recoil rocked back through her shoulder, and a heartbeat later through her scope, she watched the muzzle flash on that ridge go dark forever. First position suppressed, she muttered to herself, already swinging toward the second flash of gunfire further down the ridgeline. A shooter positioned to rake fire directly into the Marines pinned behind the second vehicle. She fired again. The second shooter's silhouette jerked and dropped from view. Second ridge shooter neutralized. Below her, the battle was reaching a terrible crescendo. More Marines pinned, more vehicles burning. The sound of panicked shouting drifting up faintly through the gunfire and explosions. Ava forced herself to breathe, to stay in the rhythm, to not think about Ethan's face or Foster's warning or anything except the next target and the next and the next. A third position revealed itself as a shooter shifted for a better angle on the Marines below, and Ava's shot found him before he ever completed the movement. Third hidden shooter eliminated. But even as 3 positions fell silent, more gunfire erupted from a fourth location, heavier now coordinated, clearly a machine gun position, raking sustained fire down into the wreckage of the convoy, pinning down every Marine who might have otherwise found a moment to counterattack. Ava adjusted, calculated, fired. The fourth position didn't go silent immediately. It took a second shot, then a third, the gunner shifting position with a discipline that told her these were not amateur insurgents, but trained fighters who understood exactly what they were facing on that ridge. Finally, on her fourth round, the position collapsed into silence. Fourth position destroyed under coordinated counterfire. Ava breathed, sweat now running down her temple despite the cold morning air. Her hands beginning for the first time in years to show the faintest tremor of exhaustion and adrenaline. But she wasn't finished. Somewhere on that ridge, she knew there had to be someone directing this, someone whose position and discipline suggested command authority rather than simple foot soldier tactics. And if that person survived, this wasn't over. It would only be the beginning of something far worse. She found him at nearly 900 meters, tucked into a fortified position with a clear line down into the valley, calm and controlled, even as his other positions fell one by one. A man who understood that his job was not to run, but to finish what had been started, whatever the cost. Ava's hand steadied. Her breathing slowed to almost nothing. The distance was extreme, further than anything she had fired during her demonstration at the range, further than anything that should have been possible under combat conditions. With her hands shaking and her heart pounding and the sound of dying men echoing up from the valley below. But this was not the range. This was not a demonstration for people who had doubted her. This was the only thing standing between a handful of Marines and complete annihilation. She exhaled slowly, found her stillness in the eye of the storm, the way she had trained herself to do across years, she still could not speak of, and fired. The command position on the ridge went silent. "Fifth position," Ava whispered into the sudden ringing quiet that followed. "Command sniper, 980 meters, confirmed kill." For a long moment, the valley below fell into an eerie stillness. The gunfire finally stopping, smoke rising in thick black columns from the burning vehicles. The only sound, the distant crackle of flames, and faintly the groans of wounded men beginning to move again, now that the deadly rain from the ridgeline had finally stopped. Ava lowered her rifle with hands that were shaking now fully and completely, the adrenaline finally breaking through the wall of discipline she had held for the last several minutes. She keyed her radio with trembling fingers. "Foster," she said, her voice raw. "Foster, do you copy? All hostile positions on the eastern ridge are neutralized. I need medevac to the convoy position immediately." Static crackled, and then Foster's voice came through, shaken but alive. "Copy that, Mitchell. Medevac inbound. God, Mitchell, how many were there?" "5, Ava said quietly, staring down into the smoke-filled valley where Marines were beginning to emerge from cover, checking on each other, dragging wounded toward whatever shelter remained. 5 positions, all coordinated, all timed perfectly to hit the convoy exactly where visibility was worst and cover was thinnest. There was a pause on the radio, heavy with the weight of what she wasn't saying yet. "That's not luck," Foster said slowly. "That's not opportunity. That's planning." "Yes," Ava said, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the smoking wreckage below, already feeling the cold certainty crystallizing in her chest that this ambush, precise and devastating as it was, had not been the end of the danger threatening this base. It had only been the visible part of something far larger, something that had required knowledge no outside enemy should have possessed. Knowledge of routes and schedules and gaps in security that only someone inside the wire could have provided. "Foster," Ava said quietly, her gaze drifting back toward the base, toward the command tent, toward the memory of Briggs standing in her path that morning, with his hand drifting toward his jacket pocket, and words tumbling out of him that had sounded almost like a warning, almost like a confession he hadn't quite found the courage to finish. "Foster," she said again, "I don't think the enemy that did this was only outside the wire." The radio went silent for a long moment. "Say again, Mitchell." Ava's jaw tightened as she began climbing down from her overwatch position, moving fast now, her rifle slung across her back, her mind already racing 3 steps ahead toward a conclusion she didn't want to reach, but couldn't ignore. "I think we have a problem inside our own camp," she said, "and I think I know exactly where to start looking." Below her in the smoking ruins of the valley, Marines were still pulling themselves from the wreckage alive because of 5 shots fired by a woman they had mocked and dismissed just days earlier. And above the valley in the cold morning air, Ava Mitchell began the long walk back toward the base, carrying with her the terrible certain knowledge that the true battle, the one that would decide everything, had not happened in that valley at all. It was only just beginning. The medevac helicopters were already thundering low over the valley by the time Ava reached the convoy wreckage, their rotor wash flattening the smoke into long gray ribbons that clung to the burned-out shells of the lead vehicles. She moved faster than her exhausted legs wanted to carry her, scanning every face she passed for the one she needed most. Ethan. He was on his knees beside a wounded private, pressing a field dressing, hard against the man's shoulder, his hands shaking but steady enough to keep pressure where it counted. He looked up at the sound of her voice, and something in his face cracked open with relief. "You're alive," he said, half a laugh, half a sob. "I saw the ridge light up, and I thought, I'm fine," Ava said, dropping to a crouch beside him, checking the wounded man's pulse with practiced fingers. "Where's Foster?" "Command vehicle back of the column, he's coordinating medevac." "Get this man on the first bird out," Ava said, already rising. "I need to find him." She found Captain Foster standing beside the twisted frame of the command vehicle radio pressed to his ear, his uniform streaked with soot and someone else's blood. He turned as she approached, and the look on his face told her he had already been turning her last transmission over in his mind the entire time she'd been climbing down from the ridge. "Say it again," he said before she'd even opened her mouth. "What you said on the radio, say it to my face." 5 coordinated positions, Ava said, her voice low controlled, though her pulse was still hammering from the climb and the fight. "Time to hit us exactly where the convoy would be moving slowest, exactly where our sight lines were worst. That's not opportunistic. That's not a lucky ambush some local fighter stumbled into. Someone gave them our schedule, our route, our vulnerabilities." Foster's jaw tightened. "You're talking about a leak." "I'm talking about someone inside this wire," Ava said, "who has been feeding information out for longer than today." "That's a hell of an accusation, Sergeant." "It's not an accusation yet," Ava said. "It's a hypothesis, but I intend to test it." Foster studied her for a long moment, the chaos of the wreckage still swirling around them, wounded men being loaded onto stretchers, Marines shouting coordinates into radios, the smell of burning fuel thick in the air. Whatever doubt he'd carried about her since she'd first arrived on that helicopter had burned away somewhere in the last 20 minutes, replaced by something closer to trust, though trust that came with its own weight of dread. "Who do you suspect?" he asked quietly. Ava's eyes drifted back toward the base, toward the memory of Briggs blocking her path that morning, his hand drifting toward his jacket, the crack in his voice when he told her to be careful. "I have a name," she said, "but I want proof before I say it out loud. An accusation without proof just gives a guilty man time to cover his tracks." Foster exhaled slowly, the sound almost a groan. "Command is going to want answers within the hour. 5 KI, A-11 wounded, 3 vehicles destroyed. This is going to go all the way up the chain." "Then let it," Ava said, "because if there's a leak feeding information to whoever set this up, it doesn't stop with today. It gets worse. Next time it might not be a supply convoy. It might be the whole base." The words hung in the smoke-thick air between them, and Foster felt something cold settle into his chest, the particular fear of a commander who realized the danger to his men might be standing closer than he ever imagined. By the time the last of the wounded had been loaded and the convoy's survivors made their slow, shaken way back to base, the sun had climbed high enough to burn off the morning's gray clouds, though nothing about the mood on base had lightened to match it. Marines moved through the camp in near silence, faces pale, hands still trembling from adrenaline that had nowhere left to go. Somewhere near the medical tent, a young private sat alone on an ammo crate staring at nothing, and Ava recognized in his face the particular hollow look of a man who had watched friends die and hadn't yet found the place inside himself to put it. She didn't stop to comfort him. Not yet. There would be time for that later if there was a later at all. Right now, every minute mattered. She found Ethan near the motor pool helping unload the wounded, his hands finally still now that the immediate crisis had passed, though his eyes still carried the wide, unsettled look of someone who had crossed a line today he could never uncross. "I need your help," Ava said, pulling him aside. "Anything," Ethan said immediately and meant it. "I need to know everyone who had access to this week's convoy schedule. Not just who was briefed, who could have seen it copied, it passed it along even accidentally." Ethan's brow furrowed. "You think someone leaked the route?" "I know someone leaked the route," Ava said. "What I don't know yet is who." "That's half the base, Ava. The schedule's posted in the command tent. Anyone with clearance walks past it a dozen times a day." "Then narrow it," Ava said. "Who had motive? Who had opportunity to communicate outside the wire? Who's been acting strange?" Ethan hesitated and something crossed his face, a flicker of reluctance that Ava caught immediately. "What is it?" she asked. "It's probably nothing." "Ethan." He glanced around the motor pool, lowering his voice, even though no one was close enough to hear. "Briggs has a satellite phone, personal one, not standard issue. I saw him with it a few nights ago out near the fuel depot talking low. I figured it was just, I don't know, girlfriend back home, family stuff. Didn't think much of it." Ava's pulse quickened, though her face betrayed nothing. "When exactly, 2 nights ago, maybe 3. 2 nights before the convoy schedule had been finalized. 2 nights before Ava herself had first raised concerns about the Valley Pass to Foster." The timeline clicked into place with a precision that made her stomach turn cold. "Where is he now?" she asked. "Briggs, I think he's still out with the recovery team pulling gear off the burned vehicles." Ava was already moving before Ethan finished the sentence, cutting across the camp with long, purposeful strides, her mind racing through everything she'd observed since her first night on this base. The mockery, the cruelty, and underneath it something else she'd noticed but hadn't fully weighed until now. The way Briggs had needled her hardest pushed, loudest, precisely at the moments when she'd started asking the sharpest questions about terrain, about security gaps, about the valley pass itself, as if he'd been trying to make her doubt herself before she got too close to something he needed kept buried. She found him near the burned convoy vehicles at the edge of the motor pool. Sleeves rolled up, sweat and soot streaking his forearms as he hauled a scorched supply crate off the back of a wrecked truck. He looked up as she approached, and something flickered across his face, quick and involuntary, gone, almost before it registered. Fear. "Mitchell," he said, forcing his voice into something like normal. "Heard you did some shooting up on that ridge. Command's saying you saved the whole column." "We need to talk," Ava said. "About what?" "About the phone call you made 2 nights ago, near the fuel depot." Briggs's hands went still on the crate. For a long moment, he didn't say anything at all, and in that silence, Ava had all the confirmation she needed, though it still wasn't proof, not the kind that would hold up to a formal inquiry. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said finally, but his voice had lost its usual bite. "Ethan saw you," Ava said. "Personal satellite phone, low voice. 2 nights before a convoy walked into an ambush that killed 5 of your fellow Marines." "That doesn't mean anything," Briggs snapped, dropping the crate harder than necessary. "Lots of guys have personal phones. You want to arrest me for calling my sister?" "Is that who you called?" "Yes." "Then you won't mind if the phone gets checked." Something shifted behind Briggs' eyes, a calculation fast and desperate. "You don't have the authority to search my personal property." "No," Ava agreed. "But Captain Foster does, and after what happened this morning, I don't think he's going to hesitate to use it." Briggs's face went through several expressions in quick succession: anger, fear, something almost like grief, before settling into a hard defensive mask. "You've had it out for me since the day you got here," he said. "You think I don't know that? You think this isn't just you looking for a way to get back at me for embarrassing you in front of the guys?" "I don't care about being embarrassed, Briggs," Ava said quietly. "I care about the 5 Marines who came home in body bags this morning. I care about the 11 who are lying in that medical tent right now. If you had nothing to do with what happened, then a phone check clears your name in 5 minutes and we never speak of it again. But if you refuse..." She let the sentence hang there unfinished and watched him wrestle with it. "Fine," Briggs said, finally, his jaw tight. "Check the damn phone. You'll find nothing but a call to my sister and some old messages from my ex-wife. Waste your time if you want." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the satellite phone, shoving it toward her, and for one heart-stopping moment, Ava thought he might actually be telling the truth, that her instincts had led her astray for the first time in longer than she could remember. Then she powered it on and began scrolling through the call log, and her blood ran cold. The most recent outgoing call wasn't to a sister. It wasn't to an ex-wife. It was to a number with no name attached, no contact, save just a string of digits that meant nothing to her at a glance, but would mean everything once someone with the right clearance traced it. And the call had lasted 6 minutes, made at 2:14 in the morning, 2 nights before the convoy rolled into that valley. 6 minutes, Ava said quietly, holding up the screen so Briggs could see it. "That's a long call to your sister at 2 in the morning. Briggs stared at the phone, and for the first time since she'd known him, all the bluster drained out of his face completely, leaving behind something small and frightened that Ava almost felt sorry for. "It's not what you think," he said, his voice cracking. "Then tell me what it is." Briggs opened his mouth, and for one suspended moment, Ava thought he might actually confess everything right there in the motor pool, surrounded by burned trucks and the lingering smell of smoke. But before he could speak, a voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Mitchell, Briggs, command tent. Now." Captain Foster stood 20 feet away, his face grim, a folded piece of paper clutched in one hand, and something in his expression told Ava that whatever had just arrived by radio was about to change everything. They walked to the command tent in tense silence, Briggs a half step behind Ava the entire way, his eyes darting toward the tree line beyond the perimeter fence, as though he were calculating the distance to somewhere he could disappear. Ava noticed. She filed it away. Inside the tent, Foster set the paper down on the folding table between them, his expression unreadable. Signals Intelligence picked up an encrypted transmission originating from inside our operational network, he said. Not from the valley, not from outside the wire at all. From here. This base. The words landed in the tent like a physical blow. Briggs's face went white. When? Ava asked. Timestamp puts it at 02:14 hours 2 nights ago. Foster looked up, his eyes moving slowly, deliberately from Ava to Briggs and back again. Same time as a satellite call I understand someone's already confirmed was made from this base. Briggs's mouth opened, closed, opened again. This is insane, he said, his voice rising. Panic bleeding through every syllable now. You're trying to pin 5 deaths on me because of one phone call. I want a lawyer. I want this handled through proper channels, not some field interrogation. Nobody's interrogating you, Staff Sergeant, Foster said, his voice deadly calm, the voice of a commander who had just watched 5 of his Marines die and had no patience left for games. But you are going to sit down and you are going to explain to me exactly who you called and exactly what you told them, or I am going to assume the absolute worst, and given the body count from this morning, the absolute worst is going to end your career and possibly your freedom for the rest of your life. Briggs sank into the folding chair across from Foster's desk, his hands trembling now. All the fight finally drained out of him. For a long moment he said nothing, staring down at his own hands as though he didn't recognize them. I didn't know they'd hit the convoy, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I swear to God, I didn't know it would be like that. Start from the beginning, Ava said quietly, pulling up a chair, her voice softer now, coaxing rather than accusing, because she had learned long ago that a frightened man confessed faster to sympathy than to threats. Who did you call? Briggs was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of shame that made even Ava, who had every reason to despise him, feel a flicker of something almost like pity. There's a man, he said, local contact. I met him through a supply contractor about 4 months ago. He offered money, real money, more than I make in a year for information. Base routines, patrol schedules, nothing that seemed like it mattered at the time. I told myself it was just logistics, nothing that could get anyone hurt. And the convoy schedule, Foster asked, his voice hard as stone. Briggs flinched. He asked about it specifically, said he had buyers interested in disrupting supply lines, said it was about money, about black market goods getting intercepted, not about killing anyone. I believed him. I wanted to believe him because the alternative meant admitting what I actually was. His voice cracked entirely now, tears standing in his eyes that he made no attempt to hide. I didn't know they'd set up an ambush. I didn't know Marines were going to die. I swear on everything I have, I didn't know. The tent fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. Ava studied Briggs's face, searching for the lie, the manipulation, the same cruelty he'd shown her from the very first moment she'd stepped off that helicopter. But what she found instead was something smaller and sadder, a weak man who had made a catastrophic choice for reasons that had nothing to do with ideology and everything to do with greed and self-deception, and who was only now, with 5 bodies on his conscience, beginning to understand the true weight of what he'd done. Whether you knew or not, Ava said finally, 5 Marines are dead, 11 more are wounded. You handed a weapon to the people who did that, Briggs. Ignorance doesn't wash blood off your hands. I know, Briggs said, his voice breaking completely, now his shoulders shaking. I know that. I'll know it every day for the rest of my life. Foster stood, his face carved from granite, every trace of the exhaustion from the morning's battle replaced by a cold, controlled fury. Staff Sergeant Dale Briggs, you are under arrest pending court-martial on charges including, but not limited to, espionage, conspiracy, and complicity in the deaths of United States Marines. Anything you say from this point forward can and will be used against you. 2 MPs entered the tent at Foster's signal, and Briggs rose without resistance, his eyes finding Ava's for one last moment as they led him away. For what it's worth, he said quietly, you were the best Marine on this base from the day you arrived. I was too much of a coward to admit it until it was too late to matter. Ava said nothing. There was nothing to say to a man who had traded the lives of his brothers for money he'd never even mentioned spending. The MPs let him out, and the tent fell into a heavy quiet, the kind that presses down on a room after violence has passed and left only consequences behind. You were right, Foster said, finally sinking back into his chair, rubbing a hand over his face. About all of it. The corridor, the leak, Briggs. I should have listened to your instincts from the beginning instead of waiting for proof. You listened when it mattered, Ava said. That's more than most commanders would have done. Foster looked up at her, something complicated moving behind his eyes. There's something else, he said slowly. Something I haven't told you yet because I wasn't sure how or whether it was even my place to. Ava's instincts prickled immediately, the same cold certainty she'd felt standing on that ridge before the first explosion tore through the valley. Tell me. Foster reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a thin folder, sliding it across the table toward her. This came down through a separate channel 6 weeks before you were assigned here. Above my normal clearance, honestly, but command felt I needed to know, given my position. He hesitated. There's been a suspected leak in this operational sector for months. Suspicious patterns. Missions compromised. Intelligence that seemed to reach the wrong hands faster than it should have. Command suspected the leak was coming from inside this specific base, but they had no proof. No clear suspect and no way to investigate without tipping off whoever was responsible and driving them further underground. Ava's hand stilled on the folder, not yet opening it. What does this have to do with me? Foster met her eyes, and something in his expression told her the answer before he said it out loud. You weren't assigned here as ordinary reinforcement, Sergeant, he said quietly. Your transfer orders came through a special channel. You were placed here specifically because of your background, your skill set, your particular talent for noticing things other people miss. You were sent here, Ava, to find the leak. This entire deployment from the moment you stepped off that helicopter was built around a 6-week counterintelligence operation, and I was the only person on this base cleared to know it. The words hit Ava like a physical blow, and for a long, disorienting moment, every piece of her time on this base rearranged itself in her mind. The transfer orders that had arrived with no explanation. The strange gaps in her own file that even she hadn't fully understood the reasoning behind the sense she'd had since her very first night here that something about this posting didn't add up to a simple reassignment. You're telling me, she said slowly, that command sent me here as bait. Not bait, Foster said carefully. A trigger. Someone whose skill would be impossible to ignore, whose presence would force whoever was leaking information to either expose themselves through overreaction or to make a mistake trying to neutralize a threat they couldn't predict or control. Briggs's hostility toward you from day one, the way he escalated so quickly, so publicly, command theorized that whoever was compromised would see you as a threat to be managed one way or another. And they were right. Ava sat in silence, processing the enormity of what she'd just been told, feeling a strange mixture of anger and grim vindication settle into her chest. She had spent every day since her arrival believing she was simply enduring another posting, another set of men who needed to be shown the hard way that she belonged. She hadn't realized she was a weapon being deployed with surgical precision against an enemy that had been hiding in plain sight for months. You could have told me, she said finally, her voice tight. I couldn't, Foster said, and there was genuine regret in his voice now. If you'd known from the beginning, your behavior might have changed in ways that tipped off whoever was compromised before we had a chance to identify them. The operation only worked because your reactions, your instincts, your investigation, and all of it was real, genuine. That's precisely what made it effective. Ava absorbed this in silence, and slowly, despite the anger simmering beneath her calm exterior, she understood the brutal logic of it. She had been the perfect instrument for exactly this operation, not because she'd been told what to look for, but because she hadn't needed to be told. Her instincts, honed across years of experience she still refused to speak about openly, had done exactly what command had hoped they would do, faster and more effectively than any briefed operative might have managed. Does anyone else know, she asked, about the operation, about my real purpose here? No one, Foster said. Not Ethan, not the rest of the unit. As far as anyone else on this base is concerned, you're exactly what your orders say. You are a sniper, reinforcement, nothing more. And Briggs, is he the only one? Or is there someone else still out there, still compromised, still feeding information to whoever's on the other end of that satellite line? Foster's expression darkened. That, he said, is the part of this that worries me most. Briggs was a source, a weak, greedy man who sold information for money without fully understanding the consequences. But someone recruited him. Someone identified him as a vulnerability and exploited it with patience and precision. That kind of operation doesn't usually rely on a single point of failure. The implications settled over Ava like a physical weight. Briggs's arrest wasn't the end of this. It was at best the removal of one thread from a web that might extend far beyond this single base into networks and connections she couldn't yet see. "We need Briggs's phone analyzed immediately," she said, already moving into the focused, methodical mindset that had carried her through the ambush hours earlier. Every number, every contact, every message. If he was recruited, there's a recruiter, and that person is still out there, still operating, possibly still watching this base right now to see how we respond to losing their source. "I've already flagged it for immediate forensic analysis," Foster said. "Results should come back within 24 hours. "That's not fast enough," Ava said. "If whoever's on the other end of that connection realizes Briggs has been arrested, they'll go dark, immediately destroy every trace, disappear into whatever network protects them. We have a very narrow window before that happens." Foster studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted in acknowledgement that the woman sitting across from him had moved in the span of a single conversation from subject of a counterintelligence operation to its most valuable asset. "What do you need?" he asked. "Full access to the phone's data the moment it's extracted," Ava said. "And I need to speak with Briggs again, alone, before he has time to fully process what's happening to him and shut down completely. Frightened, guilty men talk more freely in the first hours after their arrest than they ever will again once they've had time to think about lawyers and consequences." Foster nodded slowly. "I'll arrange it." As Ava rose to leave the tent, Foster's voice stopped her at the entrance. "Ava," he said, using her first name for the first time since she'd arrived, and something in the shift told her this next part mattered to him personally, not just professionally. "For what it's worth, I know this wasn't fair to you. Being used this way without your knowledge or consent while enduring everything Briggs and the others put you through. You deserve better than being treated like a tool in someone else's chess game." Ava paused at the tent flap, considering his words, feeling the weight of everything that had happened settle into some place inside her that she would need time later to fully process. "I've been a tool in worse games than this one," she said finally, her voice quiet but without bitterness. "At least this time, the tool got to choose how sharp it wanted to be." She stepped out of the tent into the harsh midday sun, the camp around her still buzzing with the aftermath of the ambush, medics moving between tents, Marines gathering in small, shaken clusters to process what they'd survived. She found Ethan near the medical tent, sitting on an overturned crate, his hands finally steady, his eyes red-rimmed from exhaustion and grief. "Is it true?" he asked as she approached. "Briggs, all of it." Word traveled fast on a small base, faster than any official announcement could contain it. "It's true," Ava said, sitting beside him. Ethan shook his head slowly, staring at the ground. "I served with that man for 8 months, 8 meals with him, trusted him to watch my back on patrol." His voice cracked. "How do you miss something like that? How do you serve beside someone for that long and not see what they really are?" "You don't always see it," Ava said. "That's the nature of betrayal. It doesn't announce itself. It hides behind ordinary faces, ordinary conversations, ordinary jokes at breakfast. The only defense is staying alert even when everything looks normal, especially when everything looks normal, because that's exactly when people let their guard down." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Is that what you were doing? This whole time, staying alert?" Ava considered how much to tell him, weighing the operational secrecy Foster had sworn her to against the simple human decency of not lying to someone who had shown her nothing but kindness since the moment she'd arrived. "I was doing what I always do," she said, which was true even if it wasn't the whole truth. Watching, listening, trying to see what other people miss. Ethan looked at her for a long moment, something searching in his expression, and Ava wondered if he sensed there was more beneath her words than she was willing to share. But he didn't press, and for that she was grateful. "What happens now?" he asked instead. "Now," Ava said, rising from the crate, her eyes drifting back toward the command tent where Foster was already coordinating with signals, intelligence to trace every digit from Briggs's satellite phone. "We find out how deep this actually goes." That evening, as the sun began its slow descent behind the mountains, painting the sky in colors that felt almost obscenely beautiful given the horror the day had contained, Ava sat alone outside the interrogation tent where Briggs was being held, waiting for the moment Foster had promised her a chance to speak with him alone, before lawyers and formal proceedings closed the small window of raw, unguarded honesty that fear had cracked open in him. Inside, when she finally entered, Briggs looked up at her with the hollow, sunken eyes of a man who had spent the last several hours confronting exactly what he'd become. "Come to gloat," he asked, though there was no venom left in his voice, only exhaustion. "Come to ask you to help me stop whoever did this from hurting anyone else," Ava said, sitting across from him. "Whatever happens to you now, Briggs, that part is out of my hands and out of yours. But you can still do one right thing before this is over. Tell me everything about the man who recruited you. Every detail. His voice. Anything he said about his operation. Any name he ever used, even a fake one." Briggs studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression suggested he was genuinely weighing the offer, searching for whatever fragment of honor might still exist in a man who had already betrayed everything he once claimed to believe in. "He called himself Marcus," Briggs said finally. "Never gave a last name. Spoke English well, but not like a native speaker. Careful with his words, like he was translating in his head before he said anything out loud." He paused, his hands twisting together on the table. "He mentioned once, almost in passing, that he had other sources, other bases. He made it sound like this was bigger than just me, bigger than just this one FOB. Ava's pulse quickened. "Did he say where which bases?" "No, but he said something else near the end of our last real conversation before the convoy." Briggs's voice dropped almost to a whisper, as though even now, under arrest, surrounded by armed guards, he was afraid of being overheard. "He said the Valley ambush wasn't really about the convoy at all. He said it was a message, a demonstration to prove to someone above him that his network could deliver results on command." The words settled over Ava like ice water. "A demonstration for who?" she asked. Briggs shook his head slowly. "I don't know. He never said, but the way he talked about it, Ava, it wasn't like talking about local insurgents settling a score. It was like talking about a business deal. Like he was proving something to investors." Ava sat back, her mind racing through the implications, the terrible scale of what Briggs' confession suggested. This wasn't a single compromised sergeant selling information for extra cash. This was a network-organized patient operating across multiple bases with ambitions that reached far beyond one valley pass in one forgotten corner of Afghanistan. And if Briggs was right, if the ambush had truly been a demonstration meant to prove capability to someone higher up the chain of whatever organization Marcus represented, then the 5 Marines who died in that valley had been sacrificed not for territory, not for ideology, but as a grim advertisement. "Thank you," Ava said quietly, rising from the table, her mind already moving 3 steps ahead toward the conversation she needed to have with Foster. "Ava," Briggs said, stopping her at the tent flap, his voice small and broken in a way that no longer resembled the man who had mocked her on her very first day. "For what it's worth, I really am sorry. Not because I got caught, because of what it could. I keep seeing their faces. I don't think I'll ever stop." Ava paused, looking back at him, feeling none of the satisfaction she might have imagined feeling toward the man who had humiliated her so publicly just days before. "Good," she said simply. "Carry that. It's the only thing left that you can still do right." She stepped out into the cooling evening air and found Foster waiting exactly where she expected him, his expression tightening the moment he read the urgency in her face. "There's more," she said. "Much more than we thought." Foster's jaw set into a hard, determined line. "Tell me." "This isn't isolated to us," Ava said. Briggs's contact hinted at other compromised sources, other bases. And the ambush wasn't just an attack. It was a demonstration meant to prove something to people, even further up, whatever chain this network answers to. Foster stared at her in the fading light, the full weight of what she was describing settling slowly into his expression. "You're saying this is bigger than a single leak. You're saying we've stumbled onto something regional, maybe larger." "I'm saying," Ava said, "that we need to move fast before whoever's above Marcus in this chain realizes their demonstration succeeded a little too well and decides it's time to either escalate or disappear completely." Somewhere beyond the base perimeter in the darkening hills where the valley pass had swallowed 5 lives that morning, The network that had orchestrated it all was already receiving word through channels far more sophisticated than a single satellite phone that their asset inside the base had been compromised. And in a location far beyond anything Ava Mitchell or Captain Foster could yet imagine. A decision was already being made about what to do next. A decision that would determine whether this story ended with the arrest of one broken sergeant, or whether it was only the first thread pulled from something far larger, far darker, and far more dangerous than anyone on that quiet, blood-soaked, forward operating base had yet begun to understand. The forensic report on Briggs's satellite phone came back in 18 hours, instead of the promised 24, and Foster woke Ava before dawn to deliver it personally, his face carrying the particular gray exhaustion of a man who had not slept and would not sleep again until this thing was finished. "You need to see this now," he said, sliding a tablet across the folding table in the command tent. Ava scanned the data, her eyes narrowing with each line. The number Briggs had called wasn't just active. It had been active for months, pinging cell towers across 3 separate provinces, always moving, never staying in one location long enough to be triangulated with any precision. But buried in the metadata in a cluster of communications the analysts had flagged as unusual was something that made Ava's breath catch. The same number had been in contact with 2 other phones registered to personnel at different forward operating bases nearly 60 miles apart. 2 more, she said quietly. Briggs wasn't lying about a network. "Command's already moving on it," Foster said, "but that's not the part that should worry you most." He tapped the screen, scrolling to a final entry, a message thread that had been sent and deleted within minutes, recovered only through deep forensic extraction. The message was short, almost clinical, sent less than 4 hours after the ambush in the valley. "Asset Mitchell exceeded expectations. Recommend elevated priority." Ava read it twice, feeling something cold settle into the pit of her stomach that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the terrible clarity of understanding exactly what those words meant. "They know who I am," she said. "They know what you did," Foster corrected, though his voice carried little comfort. 5 confirmed eliminations at extreme range in the middle of a coordinated ambush that was supposed to succeed without resistance. Whoever's running this network just watched their demonstration fail spectacularly because of one sniper they didn't account for. That message isn't a threat, Ava. It's worse. It's a business decision. They're not planning to retaliate out of anger. They're recalculating. Recalculating what? Foster met her eyes, and the grim certainty in his expression told her the answer before he spoke it aloud. "Whether you're a problem to eliminate," he said, "or an asset worth acquiring." The words hung in the tense, stale morning air like smoke that refused to clear. Ava had faced threats before, more times than she could count, more times than the sanitized version of her service record would ever reveal. But there was something uniquely unsettling about being evaluated, weighed, considered for value by an enemy who saw her not as a soldier to be defeated, but as a resource to be assessed. The way a buyer inspects a piece of equipment before deciding whether it's worth the asking price. "Let them try," Ava said, and there was iron in her voice now, cold and absolute. "That's exactly what worries me," Foster said. "Because organizations that think this way, that talk about assets and elevated priority instead of enemies and casualties, they don't operate like the fighters we're used to facing out here. They're patient, they're resourced, and they don't give up just because their first attempt failed." A runner ducked into the tent before Ava could respond, breathless, his young face pale with the particular urgency of someone delivering news he didn't fully understand but knew was important. "Captain, sir, signals just intercepted something. They said you'd want it immediately." Foster took the printed transcript from the runner's shaking hand and read it in silence, his expression shifting from tension into something closer to alarm. "What is it?" Ava said. It wasn't a question. "Movement," Foster said. "Reconnaissance flights picked up vehicle activity approximately 11 kilometers northeast of our position, moving toward us, currently paused just outside detection range of our standard patrol routes." He looked up at her. 6 vehicles, organized formation, moving with a discipline that doesn't match typical insurgent activity in this region. Ava was already on her feet, her mind snapping into the same crystalline focus that had carried her through the ambush the previous day. How long until they could reach the base? If they're planning a direct assault, 2 hours, maybe less. And if they're not planning a direct assault, Foster's jaw tightened. Then I don't know what they're planning, and that scares me more. Outside the command tent, the base was beginning to stir, with the particular tension of soldiers who could sense even without official announcement that something dangerous was approaching. Ava found Ethan near the ammunition depot, already moving with purpose, distributing extra magazines to Marines who were checking their weapons, with the grim efficiency of men who had buried friends only yesterday and had no intention of losing more today. "You heard," Ava said, falling into step beside him. "Whole base heard within 10 minutes, Ethan said, not looking up from the crate he was unpacking. "Foster doesn't waste time keeping secrets when lives are on the line." He paused, glancing sideways at her. "You think it's them? The people behind the ambush?" "I think," Ava said carefully, "that whoever ordered yesterday's ambush just found out it failed because of me specifically, and now there's a formation of vehicles heading this direction that doesn't move like the insurgents we usually deal with. I don't believe in coincidences that convenient." Ethan's hands stilled on the ammunition crate. "So what do? We stop reacting," Ava said, "and we start anticipating. Where's Foster planning to position defensive lines?" "Standard perimeter reinforcement." "Why?" "Because standard isn't going to be enough," Ava said, already turning toward the command tent, her mind racing through terrain, angles, choke points, everything she'd cataloged in her notebook since the very first morning she'd walked this base's perimeter. If this is the same network that planned the Valley ambush with that level of precision, they're not going to throw 6 vehicles at a fortified position head on. That's not how patient people operate. There's something else happening that we're not seeing yet. She found Foster hunched over the terrain map exactly where she expected him, already deep in the calculations of defensive strategy. "I need to say something," Ava said, "and I need you to actually consider it instead of dismissing it as instinct without evidence, because that instinct has been right every single time since I arrived on this base." Foster looked up, and something in his expression told her he had already learned that lesson thoroughly enough not to need reminding. "Talk." 6 vehicles moving in disciplined formation, pausing just outside our detection range, Ava said, tapping the map. "That's not an assault force preparing to charge a fortified position. That's a demonstration force. Or a diversion." "Diversion from what?" "That's what worries me," Ava said, "because I don't know yet. But if I were running this operation and my last attempt to disrupt this base failed, because a single sniper dismantled 5 prepared positions in under 10 minutes, I wouldn't send my next wave in for a repeat performance against an enemy who's already proven capable of that. I'd use the visible threat to draw attention and resources toward the front, while the real move happened somewhere else entirely." Foster's eyes moved across the map, tracing the base's perimeter. The supply routes, the vulnerable points Ava had documented over her days of quiet reconnaissance. Somewhere else, like where Ava's finger moved to a spot on the map that made her blood run cold the moment she considered it. The detention area, where Briggs is being held. Foster went very still. "You think they're coming for him?" "I think," Ava said, "that a man who sold information for money is worth far more to this network dead and silent than alive and talking to counterintelligence officers. Especially now that they know we've identified him, arrested him, and started pulling threads from his phone that already led us to 2 more compromised assets at other bases. If Briggs starts naming names under formal interrogation, this network's entire operation across multiple locations could unravel. That's not a risk they can afford to take." The full weight of what she was suggesting settled over the tent like a physical pressure. Foster grabbed his radio, immediately barking orders to reinforce the detention area, but even as the words left his mouth, Ava was already moving her instincts, screaming that whatever was about to happen, it was happening faster than anyone anticipated. She reached the detention area just as the first explosion tore through the perimeter fence 200 meters to the west, a diversionary charge that sent Marines scrambling toward the breach, exactly as Ava had feared, drawing eyes and rifles away from the smaller, quieter structure where Briggs sat under guard. "Eyes on the detention tent!" Ava shouted, sprinting the final distance, her rifle already coming off her shoulder. "This is the diversion. This is the diversion. Do not pull the detention guards." But confusion was already spreading through the camp, radios crackling with conflicting reports, Marines torn between the explosion at the western fence and the urgent warning coming from a sergeant who, despite everything she'd proven over the past 2 days, was still fighting the base's ingrained instinct to respond to the loudest threat rather than the smartest one. Ava reached the detention tent to find 2 guards still in position, weapons raised, scanning the darkness beyond their small perimeter of light with the tense alertness of men who understood, even without her warning fully reaching them, that something was wrong. "Anyone approach?" Ava asked, breathless. "Negative, Sergeant, but—" The guard's sentence died in his throat as a suppressed round took him in the shoulder, spinning him backward before he even registered the muzzle flash from the darkness beyond the tent line. Ava was moving before he hit the ground, dragging him back behind cover as the second guard opened fire blindly into the shadows. "Hold your fire! Identify your target!" Ava snapped, scanning the darkness through her scope with the same predatory calm that had carried her through the valley ambush, refusing to let panic dictate her actions even as adrenaline screamed through her veins. There, a shape low and fast moving between two supply crates 30 meters out, clearly trained, clearly professional, nothing like the disorganized insurgent fighters this base typically dealt with. Ava fired once and the shape dropped and didn't move again. "Contact 30 meters southwest of the detention tent," she called into her radio, already swinging her rifle toward a second point of movement she'd caught at the edge of her peripheral vision. "Multiple hostiles. This is not the diversion. Repeat, the real assault is on the detention area." Inside the tent, she could hear Briggs shouting, panicked, pulling against restraints that suddenly represented not safety, but a death sentence if the men coming for him succeeded. Ava fired again, catching a second shape as it broke from cover, and for a moment the assault seemed to hesitate. Whoever remained recalculating in the face of resistance, they hadn't expected to encounter this quickly. Then Ethan arrived, breathless, 3 Marines behind him, having finally cut through the confused chaos of radio chatter to understand where the real threat lay. "Perimeter secure at the fence. That explosion was a diversion, just like you said," Ethan gasped, dropping into cover beside her. "Foster's rerouting everyone back this direction now." "Too slow," Ava muttered, tracking movement through her scope. "They're already inside the wire." A third shape emerged from the darkness, moving with terrifying speed directly toward the detention tent's entrance. And Ava understood in that instant that this man wasn't trying to extract Briggs. He was trying to silence him permanently before reinforcements could arrive. She fired, catching him mid-stride, and he collapsed just 3 meters from the tent flap, close enough that Ava could hear Briggs's terrified sobbing through the canvas wall. For a long, suspended moment, the darkness beyond the tent went silent. "Status," Ava called out, not lowering her rifle, every instinct still screaming that this wasn't over. "No further movement," one of the Marines reported, sweeping the perimeter with a handheld light. Foster arrived moments later with a full response team, his face carved from stone as he took in the scene. The 3 fallen attackers, the wounded guard being tended by a medic, Ava still crouched in firing position, scanning the darkness for a threat that had for the moment retreated. "Report," he said. 3 hostiles, down, professional operators, not local insurgents," Ava said, finally lowering her rifle. "The explosion at the fence was exactly what I feared. A diversion to pull our attention while a dedicated team came for Briggs." Foster's jaw tightened as he looked toward the detention tent, where Briggs's terrified sobbing had finally quieted into shaking, disbelieving silence. "They tried to kill their own source rather than risk him talking." "That confirms everything," Ava said. "This isn't a loose network of opportunists. This is an organized operation with resources, discipline, and the willingness to eliminate their own people the moment those people become liabilities. Briggs isn't just a suspect anymore. He's a witness who almost got murdered for what he knows." Inside the tent, when Ava finally entered to check on him, Briggs was shaking so violently he could barely speak. His face streaked with tears, the reality of what had almost happened finally completely shattering whatever composure he'd managed to hold on to since his arrest. "They tried to kill me," he said, his voice cracking. "My own people, the ones I was working for, they sent men to kill me." "Yes," Ava said simply, sitting across from him, offering no false comfort because false comfort wasn't what this moment required. "Why?" Briggs asked, and there was genuine broken confusion in his voice, the particular bewilderment of a man realizing too late that the people he'd trusted with his loyalty had never valued him as anything more than a disposable tool. "Because you became a risk the moment we arrested you," Ava said. "Everything you know, every name, every detail about how you were recruited, how payments were made, what you were told about their operations, all of that became a liability the second you sat down in an interrogation tent. They didn't send men to rescue you, Briggs. They sent men to make sure you never talk." Briggs stared at her, and something in his expression shifted the last fragile illusion he'd been clinging to, finally collapsing entirely. I thought maybe, I don't know what I thought, that they still needed me, that there was some kind of loyalty. There's no loyalty in what you were part of, Ava said. Only utility. You stopped being useful to them, and now you're a liability, and liabilities get eliminated. That's the entire philosophy of the people you were selling secrets to. Do you understand that now? Briggs nodded slowly, tears still tracking down his face, and for the first time since his arrest, something in his posture shifted from fear into something closer to resolve. Then I want to tell you everything, he said. Not because I'm scared, though God knows I am, because I want them to lose. I want whatever they're planning to fail completely. If that's the only thing I can still do right in this entire mess, then I want to do it. Ava studied him for a long moment, weighing the sincerity in his broken voice against the memory of the man who had mocked her mercilessly just days before, and found somewhat to her own surprise that she believed him. Then start talking, she said. Everything, every detail, no matter how small it seems. Over the following hour, Briggs poured out details with the desperate thoroughness of a man trying to purchase some measure of redemption through information. Names he'd heard in passing, descriptions of meeting locations, details about how payments had been transferred through a network of intermediaries designed to obscure the ultimate source of the money. And near the end, a detail that made Ava's blood run cold with sudden terrible clarity. He mentioned once, Briggs said that this whole operation, the network across multiple bases, wasn't really about disrupting supply lines or gathering intelligence for its own sake. He said it was building towards something bigger. A single operation coordinated across every base they'd compromised, planned for a specific date he never told me. He called it, and I remember this exactly because it stuck with me, he called it the convergence. Foster, who had entered partway through the confession and stood listening in tense silence, stepped forward, now his expression grim. Did he give any indication of timing? Any date, any window? Briggs shook his head. Only that it was close. Weeks, not months. He seemed eager, like something was accelerating faster than even he expected. Ava exchanged a look with Foster, and in that shared glance passed the full, terrible understanding of what they were now facing. This wasn't isolated sabotage anymore. This wasn't even a regional network of compromised assets feeding information for money. This was the early architecture of something coordinated, patient, and dangerously close to execution, something that reached across multiple bases and had already proven willing to sacrifice 5 Marines as nothing more than a demonstration of capability. We need to get this information up the chain immediately, Foster said. Every base with a suspected compromise needs to be alerted. And we need to move faster than they expect, Ava added. They already know their ambush failed. They already know Briggs survived the attempt on his life. Whatever timeline they had for the convergence, I'd bet everything I have that they're going to accelerate it now, not slow down, because the longer they wait, the more time we have to unravel this entire network. Foster nodded grimly and moved toward the radio to begin the process of escalating this information to a level far above his own command authority, leaving Ava alone with Briggs for one final quiet moment. Thank you, she said, and meant it despite everything. Don't thank me, Briggs said, his voice hollow. I got 5 men killed because I was greedy and stupid and let someone convince me that ignorance made me innocent. Nothing I say now undoes that. I just don't want to add more names to that list if I can help it. Ava rose to leave, but paused at the tent flap, looking back at the broken man who had spent his first days on this base tormenting her without mercy and had, through some strange and terrible turn of events, become the key to unraveling something far larger than either of them had first understood. For what it's worth, she said, echoing his own words back to him from the previous night. The man who tried to kill you tonight thought you were worthless. I think you just helped save people you'll never meet. That's not nothing, Briggs. Hold on to that, whatever happens next. She left him there alone with his thoughts and his guilt and walked back out into the cool night air, where the base was still buzzing with the aftermath of the attack, medics tending the wounded guard Marines, securing the breach in the perimeter fence. The entire camp humming with a tension that hadn't existed 24 hours earlier, when the biggest concern anyone had was whether the new female sniper could actually shoot. Ethan found her standing near the perimeter, staring out into the darkness beyond the wire, with an intensity that told him her mind was already 3 steps ahead of everyone else's. You okay? He asked. I'm thinking, Ava said, about how an organization patient enough to run a 6-week operation just to identify me as a threat, disciplined enough to send trained operators to silence their own informant rather than risk exposure, and coordinated enough to run this kind of network across multiple bases is not the kind of enemy that gives up just because 2 attempts have failed. You think they'll try again? I know they'll try again, Ava said. The only question is when and whether we'll be ready for it when they do. As if in answer to her words, a runner burst from the command tent, sprinting toward them with the particular urgency that Ava had learned over the past 2 days always preceded terrible news. Sergeant Mitchell, Captain, wants you immediately. Priority signal just came through from command. Ava exchanged a glance with Ethan before following the runner at a jog, her mind already racing through possibilities, none of them good. She found Foster inside the command tent, his face illuminated by the pale glow of a secure terminal, an expression on his face that combined disbelief with something close to dread. "What is it?" Ava said, not bothering with preamble. Foster turned the screen toward her without a word, and Ava's eyes scanned the intercepted communication that command had flagged as priority forwarded through channels that suggested this information had traveled up and down the chain of command faster than almost anything she'd seen in her career. The message was brief, encrypted, only recently decoded, originating from a source designation that made Foster's hands visibly tighten on the edge of the desk. "Confirm Mitchell neutralization failed. Escalate to phase 2. Convergence timeline move forward. All assets execute within 72 hours. Ava read it twice, feeling the full weight of those words settle over her, with a clarity that erased any lingering doubt about the scale of what they were facing. 72 hours, she said quietly. That's what it says. Foster confirmed, his voice tight with barely controlled tension. Whatever this convergence operation is, whatever they've been building toward across multiple compromised bases, they've just moved the timeline up specifically because you survived, specifically because their attempt on Briggs failed. Which means, Ava said, her mind already racing 3 steps ahead, calculating planning. We don't have weeks to unravel this network piece by piece through careful investigation. We have 3 days to identify every compromised asset, every planned target, and stop something that's already been in motion for months before we even knew it existed. Foster looked at her, and in his expression, Ava saw not just the fear of a commander facing an impossible timeline, but something else, something that had been building since the moment she'd fired that first shot on the range and shattered every assumption anyone on this base had made about her. Command wants you specifically, he said slowly, coordinating the counter-operation. Not just here, across every base flagged as potentially compromised. Why me? Because Foster said, you're the only person who's proven it twice now that you can see what everyone else misses until it's almost too late. And because whoever's running this network already considers you enough of a threat to escalate their entire timeline just to deal with you. He paused, meeting her eyes with grim, unflinching honesty. They're afraid of you, Ava. That fear just accelerated a plan that was supposed to take months into something happening in 72 hours. That makes you dangerous to them, but it also makes you exactly what we need right now. Outside the command tent, the base continued its restless preparations through the darkness. Marines reinforcing the breach perimeter, medics finishing their work on the wounded, the entire camp humming with the particular electric tension that comes before something far larger than anyone had anticipated. And somewhere beyond the wire, in locations scattered across bases Ava had never visited, and faces she had never seen, a network built on patience and betrayal was accelerating toward a convergence that would either be stopped in the next 72 hours or would unleash something far more devastating than a single ambush in a single quiet valley. Ava looked at the countdown now ticking silently in her mind, 72 hours narrowing with every passing minute, and felt the old familiar calm settle over her. The same stillness that had carried her through 5 confirmed eliminations in the chaos of that valley firefight. The same stillness that had once carried her through things she still couldn't speak of, in places that had taught her at terrible cost. Exactly what it meant to face an enemy who believed patience and cruelty could accomplish what direct confrontation could not. Then we'd better get to work, she said quietly, because in 72 hours this either ends or it becomes something none of us can stop. 68 hours remained on the clock by the time the secure video link crackled to life inside the command tent connecting Foster's small forward operating base to a conference room somewhere back at regional headquarters that neither Ava nor Foster had ever seen and probably never would. 3 officers sat on the other end of that connection, faces lit by harsh fluorescent light, and the woman in the center, a colonel whose name badge read Hargrove, fixed her eyes on Ava with the particular scrutiny of someone evaluating a legend they'd only read about on paper. "Sergeant Mitchell," Hargrove said, her voice clipped and efficient, "your file crossed my desk 18 months ago, under circumstances I'm not going to discuss over this channel. I didn't expect to be looking at your face again under these particular conditions." "Neither did I, ma'am," Ava said evenly. "We've cross-referenced the intercepted communication with intelligence from 2 other forward bases." Hargrove continued pulling up a map on a secondary screen that filled half the video feed. "FOB Halloway, 90 kilometers east of your position, and FOB Kessler near the northern border crossing. Both have flagged suspicious communications patterns consistent with what you uncovered through Briggs. We believe all 3 locations are compromised nodes in the same network." 3 nodes. Ava repeated, her mind already racing through the geometry of it. "Means this convergence operation isn't targeting a single point. It's coordinated across a triangle of positions." "That's our assessment as well," Hargrove said, "which is precisely why Command wants you coordinating this response personally. You're the only operator who's demonstrated the ability to identify this network's methodology before it strikes, not after." Foster shifted beside her. "Ma'am, with respect, Sergeant Mitchell is one operator. If this network is executing simultaneous operations across 3 bases in the next 68 hours, she can't physically be in 3 places." "She won't need to be." "Hey," Hargrove said, "we're deploying rapid response teams to Halloway and Kessler within the next 6 hours, briefed on everything you've uncovered here. But your base gentleman sits at the center of this triangle geographically, and the intercepted communication specifically named Mitchell as the reason for the accelerated timeline. Whatever they're planning, we believe the convergence point, the actual physical culmination of this operation, runs through your location." Ava felt something settle into her chest, cold and absolute. The particular clarity that came whenever a mission stopped being theoretical and became something with a face and a location and a countdown. "Define convergence point," she read. "Are we talking about another ambush? A direct assault on the base itself?" Hargrove's expression tightened, and for a moment something like genuine uncertainty flickered across her composed features. "Honestly, Sergeant, we don't know yet. The terminology in the intercepted traffic is deliberately vague, consistent with an organization sophisticated enough to compartmentalize its own communications. What we do know is that whatever happens in 72 hours 68 now was originally planned to happen with far more preparation time. You force their hand. That makes their execution potentially sloppier, but it also makes it far more dangerous because desperate organizations under compressed timelines tend to favor overwhelming force over precision." The video feed flickered briefly before Hargrove continued. "I'm authorizing full intelligence sharing between your position and the other 2 flag bases effective immediately. Captain Foster, you'll have expanded authority to reallocate base resources as Sergeant Mitchell advises. This comes from 3 levels above my own desk, so I'd suggest you both understand the weight being placed on this." The call ended, and the tent fell into a heavy silence, the kind that pressed down on both of them with the particular weight of impossible timelines and incomplete information. 68 hours, Foster said, finally rubbing a hand over his face. "To stop something we don't even fully understand spread across 3 locations executed by people desperate enough to kill their own informant rather than risk exposure. Then we stop treating this like a mystery to be solved slowly." Ava said, already moving toward the terrain map, her mind narrowing into the same focused calm that had carried her through the valley firefight. "And we start treating it like a countdown to be beaten." She spent the next 2 hours combing through everything Briggs had provided, cross-referencing it against base log supply, manifest personnel rotations, anything that might reveal the shape of what was coming. Ethan worked beside her, running searches through the base's communication records at her direction. His exhaustion visible, but his focus unshakable, driven by the same grim determination that had settled over the entire camp since the attack on the detention tent. "Ava," he said suddenly, pushing a printed log across the table toward her. "Look at this. Fuel requisitions. Someone's been pulling extra diesel allotments for the last 3 weeks, small amounts each time, never enough to trigger an audit flag, but it adds up to almost double what the base's actual vehicle usage should require. Ava studied the numbers, her pulse quickening. Who authorized the requisitions? Ethan traced his finger down the column, and his face went pale when he reached the signature line. Corporal Daniels, motor pool. Get him here, Ava said. Now before word spreads that we're looking at requisition logs. But when the MPs went to retrieve Corporal Daniels from the motor pool 20 minutes later, they returned with grim faces and empty hands. He's gone, the lead MP reported to Foster. Nobody's seen him since this morning. His personal gear is missing from his bunk. Ava's blood ran cold. He knew we were closing in. Or he was never planning to stay for the convergence at all, Foster said grimly. Which means whatever's being planned, Daniels already knew enough to run before it happened. Ava turned back to the fuel logs, her mind racing through the implications. Extra diesel accumulated slowly to avoid detection. That's not for routine base operations. That's staging fuel for something mobile. Vehicles generators, something that needs sustained power or transport beyond normal capacity. For what purpose? I don't know yet, Ava admitted, but I intend to find out before those 60-some hours run out. She walked the motor pool herself an hour later, moving through rows of vehicles and equipment with the same methodical attention she'd once given the base's perimeter fence, searching for anything that felt wrong, anything that didn't belong. Ethan trailed a half step behind her, watching her work with the quiet fascination that had never fully faded since her first morning on this base. It was in the back corner of the motor pool behind a row of decommissioned trucks that hadn't run in months that Ava found it. A tarp weathered but not weathered enough, covering something bulkier than the empty crates it was supposed to be hiding among. She pulled the tarp back and felt her stomach drop. Beneath it sat 3 modified fuel drums wired together with a crude but functional detonation system, enough explosive material to level a significant portion of the base's central operations area. Foster. Aviva's voice cut through the motor pool like a blade. Foster, get EOD out here immediately. We have a device. The next 20 minutes passed in a blur of controlled chaos. The base's explosive ordnance disposal team working with careful, deliberate precision to render the device safe, while Ava and Foster stood at a safe distance, watching the weight of how close this had come settling over both of them like a physical pressure. If we hadn't found the fuel discrepancy, Foster said quietly, if Daniels hadn't been sloppy enough to leave a paper trail. He wasn't sloppy, Ava said, cutting him off. He was rushed. This whole network is rushed, now moving faster than they planned because their original timeline got compressed. Rushed people make mistakes. That's the only reason we're standing here instead of digging through rubble. But even as the EOD team confirmed the device disarmed and safe, Ava's mind was already racing 3 steps ahead because a bomb hidden in the motor pool didn't fit the pattern of a coordinated multi-base convergence operation. It felt smaller, more desperate, more personal. This wasn't the main event, she said slowly, almost to herself. Foster turned to look at Irma. What do you mean? An organization patient enough to run a 6-week operation, disciplined enough to coordinate across 3 bases, doesn't rely on a single crude device hidden under a tarp as their primary weapon. This feels like a contingency. A fallback plan. Daniels was supposed to trigger, if things went wrong before the actual convergence, something to create chaos and cover his own escape. So the real operation is still coming. The real operation, Ava said, is still coming, and now they know we found this device, which means they know we're getting closer than they can afford to let us get. As if summoned by her words, a runner burst into the motor pool area, breathless, holding a radio handset out toward Foster with visible urgency. Sir Captain, we've got contact from FOB Holloway. Priority traffic, they're requesting immediate consultation with Sergeant Mitchell. Foster and Ava exchanged a look before moving quickly toward the command tent, where a secure connection had already been established with a young captain on the other end, whose face showed the same particular strain that had settled over Foster's own features over the past 2 days. Sergeant Mitchell, the captain said without preamble, we intercepted communications suggesting our compromised asset here at Holloway has been feeding information about a scheduled personnel rotation. A transport convoy carrying senior officers is scheduled to move through our sector in 41 hours. We believe that convoy may be a target. Ava's mind raced through the geometry of the situation, the timeline, the pattern established by the Valley ambush. Cancel the rotation. We're trying, the captain said, frustration evident in his voice. But the officers scheduled for that rotation include a brigade-level briefing that command is reluctant to postpone without concrete proof of a specific threat, not just pattern analysis. Then get them proof, Ava said sharply. Pull every communication from your compromised asset over the last month, cross-reference timing with convoy schedules, find the same signature we found here. Timed calls before route confirmations patterns that don't match innocent explanations. We're working on it, the captain said. But we don't have anyone with your specific expertise in reading these patterns. That's actually why I'm calling. Command wants to know if you can review our data remotely, help us identify what we might be missing. Ava glanced at Foster, who nodded slightly. Already understanding the impossible math of the situation, 60-some hours, 3 bases, 1 operator, whose instincts had proven sharper than anyone else's, and now being asked to divide that focus across locations she'd never seen. Send everything you have, Ava said. I'll review it as fast as I can, but Captain, I need you to understand something. I can help you identify patterns, but I can't be physically present to respond if something goes wrong at your location. Whatever defensive posture you're planning needs to stand on its own. Understood, the captain said. And Sergeant, thank you. Word about what happened in your valley has already traveled. A lot of people are grateful someone with your instincts is looking at this. The call ended, and Ava immediately buried herself in the data streaming in from Holloway, cross-referencing it against everything she'd already learned from Briggs and the fuel discrepancy at her own base. Hours blurred together, the tent lit only by the glow of screens and a single lantern. Ethan bringing her coffee she barely touched, Foster pacing back and forth as her updates trickled in from Kessler as well, where a similar pattern of suspicious activity had been identified around a scheduled equipment delivery. Somewhere around hour 50 of the countdown, exhaustion finally began cutting through Ava's focus, her eyes burning, her hands slower than they should have been, as she scrolled through yet another set of communication logs. Ethan noticed before she did, gently pulling a chair beside her and pressing a fresh cup of coffee into her hands. You need to sleep, he said quietly. Even an hour. There's no time, Ava said, not looking up from the screen. There's no time if you collapse from exhaustion at the exact moment this thing comes to a head, either. Ethan pressed his voice, carrying a gentleness that had grown between them over these past several days, something neither of them had fully acknowledged, but both of them felt. You're the sharpest instrument this operation has right now. Command needs that instrument sharp, not running on fumes. Ava looked up at him, and for just a moment, something in her carefully maintained composure cracked, revealing the sheer exhaustion of a woman who had spent 2 days processing an ambush, an assassination attempt, a bomb discovery, and now a race against the clock, spanning 3 separate bases. I keep seeing their faces, she said quietly, unexpectedly, the words slipping out before she could stop them. The Marines from the convoy. I got there in time to stop it from being worse. I didn't get there in time to stop it from happening at all. Ethan was quiet for a moment, absorbing the rare vulnerability she'd just shown him. You saved 11 men who would have died if you hadn't been on that ridge, he said finally. I know that doesn't erase the 5 you couldn't save. I don't think anything ever will, not completely. But you have to let yourself hold both things, Ava. The failure and the save. Otherwise, this job will hollow you out from the inside, and I've seen that happen to good people before. Ava studied him for a long moment, something shifting behind her eyes, and for the first time since arriving on this base, she allowed herself to simply be tired in front of another person without armor, without deflection. Thank you, she said quietly. For what? For seeing me as a person instead of a legend, or a threat, or a tool in someone else's operation, Ava said. Everyone else on this base has needed me to be one of those 3 things since the moment I arrived. You're the only one who's just talked to me like I'm a person who happens to be good at a very specific, very terrible job. Ethan smiled faintly, though exhaustion and grief still shadowed his expression. You are a person, Ava. A pretty remarkable one. Try to remember that when this is over. The moment was interrupted by Foster's voice calling from across the tent, sharp with sudden urgency. Ava, you need to see this. She crossed to his terminal immediately, and what she saw there sent ice through her veins all over again. A new intercepted communication, this one originating from a signal much closer than the previous transmissions, close enough that the analysts flagged it as originating from within a 15-kilometer radius of their own base. Mitchell review confirmed. Recommend acquisition attempt before convergence. Extraction team inbound. Acquisition, Ava said, slowly reading the word again, as though repetition might change its meaning. They're not planning to kill me anymore. They're planning to take you, Foster said, his voice tight with barely controlled alarm. Whatever value they've assigned you after watching you dismantle 5 prepared positions and identify their operative here, they've apparently decided you're worth more alive than dead. When Ava asked, though some part of her already suspected the answer would be worse than she wanted to hear, Foster checked the timestamp against the timeline they'd been tracking. The message is barely 20 minutes old. If they've got an extraction team already inbound, they could be here within the hour. Ava finished her mind, already racing through defensive options, escape routes, the terrible calculus of an enemy who no longer wanted to eliminate her, but capture her, which meant their tactics would shift entirely, favoring restraint over lethal force, at least toward her specifically. We need to move you to a secure location, Foster said immediately. Get you off this base entirely until we can coordinate a proper response. No, Ava said, the word coming out with absolute immediate certainty. Ava, this isn't the time for... Think about it, Foster, she said, cutting him off. If I disappear from this base right now, hidden away somewhere they can't reach me, what happens to the convergence timeline? What happens to Holloway, to Kessler, to whatever this network has planned across 3 locations in the next 50 hours? Running me to safety doesn't stop this operation. It just removes the one advantage we currently have, which is they think I'm valuable enough to risk an extraction attempt on a defended military base. Ava said, her mind already turning the terrible math of the situation into something resembling an opportunity. That's overconfidence, and overconfidence creates mistakes. If they're sending an extraction team here specifically for me, that team is going to try to breach this base's security, which means we get another chance to capture someone alive. Someone who might know more about this convergence operation than Briggs ever did. Foster stared at her, torn between the tactical logic of her argument and the simple human fear of watching her deliberately position herself as bait for an enemy team specifically hunting her. This is exactly what Command warned us about, he said finally. You becoming a target specifically because you're too valuable to lose and too effective to leave unchallenged. Then let's use that, Ava said. Let's turn their overconfidence into their downfall, the same way it happened with the convoy ambush. They came at us once with overwhelming coordinated force and lost 5 positions to a single sniper they didn't respect. Now they're coming for me specifically with what's probably a small specialized extraction team, moving fast, moving quiet, expecting to catch me off guard because they think a woman they initially dismissed as beneath serious consideration won't anticipate being hunted like prey. Something in Foster's expression shifted the tactical officer in him, finally overriding the protective instinct that had briefly taken hold. What do you need? I need this base to look exactly like it did an hour ago, Ava said. No visible increase in security. Nothing that would tip off an extraction team doing reconnaissance before their approach. But I need you to quietly reposition your best Marines into overwatch positions around my usual movements, my quarters, the paths I typically walk. And I need Ethan running communications intercept, watching for any local chatter that might indicate the extraction team coordinating their approach. And you, Tom, Foster asked. I do exactly what I've done since the day I arrived on this base. Ava said, a cold, controlled determination settling into her voice. I watch, I wait. And when they make their move thinking they're hunting someone who doesn't know she's being hunted, I remind them exactly why that was a very expensive mistake to make. Foster hesitated only a moment longer before nodding, already reaching for his radio to begin quietly repositioning his most trusted Marines, the entire base, shifting into a silent, invisible state of readiness that gave no outward sign to anyone watching from beyond the wire that anything had changed at all. Ava spent the next several hours moving through her normal routine with deliberate, practiced calm, walking her usual paths, checking her equipment, appearing to any observer exactly as unguarded and unaware as she had every previous day on this base. But beneath that calm exterior, every sense was heightened, every shadow cataloged, every unusual sound noted and weighed against the baseline she'd built in her mind since her very first morning here. It was nearly midnight when the first sign came subtle enough that anyone less trained would have missed it entirely. A brief flicker of movement along the tree line beyond the northern perimeter, gone almost as soon as it appeared, the kind of momentary lapse in discipline that even well-trained operators sometimes made when they believed themselves unobserved. Ava keyed her concealed radio, her voice a whisper. Movement northern tree line approximately 200 meters. Possible reconnaissance element. Foster's voice came back immediately equally quiet. Copy, holding position, waiting for full approach before engaging. Don't want to spook them into aborting before we can identify their full strength. The wait that followed stretched Ava's nerves tighter than almost anything she'd experienced since arriving on this base. The discipline required to remain visibly relaxed, while every instinct screamed at her to move, to prepare to meet the threat head-on, rather than waiting for it to fully commit. But she had learned across years she still refused to speak of openly that patience in moments like this was the difference between capturing an enemy with valuable intelligence and simply killing shadows in the dark. Learning nothing, gaining nothing beyond another body count that solved none of the larger problem, still ticking down toward convergence. 40 minutes later, the extraction team made their move. 4 figures moving with the same disciplined, professional coordination Ava had observed in the men who'd attacked the detention tent, converged toward her quarters from 2 directions, simultaneously, clearly briefed on the layout of the base, clearly confident that their approach was going undetected. They were wrong. The moment the lead figure crossed the threshold Foster's Marines had quietly established as their engagement line, floodlights snapped on across the entire sector, and Ava's voice cut through the sudden brightness with absolute authority. Drop your weapons, you are surrounded. There is no extraction, there is no escape, this ends now. For one suspended electric moment, nothing happened. The 4 figures frozen in the sudden light, clearly recalculating an operation that had just collapsed from careful precision into exposed vulnerability. Then one of them moved, reaching for something at his hip, and Ava's rifle spoke first, the round taking him in the shoulder before his weapon ever cleared its holster. The impact spinning him to the ground with a cry of pain that shattered whatever remaining discipline held the operation together. The other 3, faced with overwhelming force and the sudden devastating realization that their target had known they were coming, dropped to their knees with hands raised. The fight draining out of them in the face of Marines converging from every direction with weapons trained and voices sharp with command. Within minutes, all 4 were secured, 1 wounded but stable, the other 3 unharmed but thoroughly, completely defeated. Ava approached the wounded man slowly, her rifle still trained on him, even as medics moved to treat his injury, and something in his eyes, defiant but also afraid, told her they had just captured someone who knew far more than Briggs ever had. You should have stayed away, she said quietly. The man said nothing, his jaw clenched tight against the pain of his wound, and Ava suspected against whatever loyalty or fear kept him from speaking even now. He won't talk easily, Foster said, arriving beside her, surveying the captured team with grim satisfaction, mixed with the sober understanding that this victory, however significant, was only one piece of a much larger puzzle still racing toward its deadline. He won't need to talk easily, Ava said. Just enough, and we have less than 50 hours to make that happen. As the captured team was led away toward secure holding, Ava allowed herself a single brief moment to feel the weight of what had just happened settle over her, the terrible, undeniable confirmation that she was now a specific named target for an enemy sophisticated enough to attempt an extraction on a fortified military base, and skilled enough that only careful planning and the element of surprise had prevented that extraction from succeeding. Ethan found her standing alone near the edge of the now illuminated engagement zone, and something in his expression carried both relief and a lingering fear that hadn't yet found its way to fade. You're okay, he said, and it wasn't quite a question. I'm okay, Ava confirmed. They came for you specifically. An entire extraction team just for you. Yes, Ava said simply. Ethan was quiet for a moment, processing the reality of just how close this had come, how thin the margin between success and catastrophe had truly been. Doesn't that terrify you? Knowing there's an organization out there patient enough, resourced enough to send trained operators after one person. Ava considered the question seriously, watching the wounded extraction team member being loaded onto a stretcher, watching Foster already coordinating the interrogation that would begin the moment medical clearance allowed it. It should terrify me, she admitted quietly. Maybe some part of it does, but mostly what I feel right now is something closer to clarity. They just showed us exactly how much they fear what I might discover if left unchecked. That fear is information, Ethan. And in less than 50 hours, we're going to use everything we've learned tonight to make sure their fear was completely justified. Somewhere beyond the base perimeter, in locations Ava couldn't yet see, and faces she had never encountered, the network's leadership was already receiving word that their extraction attempt had failed catastrophically. 4 operators captured or wounded their target more prepared and more dangerous than any assessment had predicted. And in that moment of realization, somewhere far beyond the reach of Ava Mitchell's rifle or Captain Foster's command authority, a decision was already crystallizing about what would happen next. A decision that would determine whether the convergence operation, now compressed into less than 50 hours, would proceed as a coordinated strike across 3 bases, or would collapse entirely into something far more desperate and far more dangerous than anything this quiet and battled forward operating base had faced so far. The wounded extraction operator was patched up and moved into a secure interrogation tent within the hour, but the man said nothing for the first 6 of the 50 remaining hours, sitting in silence, with the flat-trained discipline of someone who had been prepared for exactly this outcome long before he ever crossed the perimeter fence. Ava watched him through a monitor feed from the command tent, studying the way he held himself, the way his eyes tracked every movement of the guards outside his tent, cataloging details, the way she'd cataloged everything else since her first morning on this base. "He's not going to break the way Briggs did," she said quietly to Foster. Briggs was greedy and weak and drowning in guilt the moment reality caught up with him. This man was trained for capture. He's waiting us out. "Then what do we do?" Foster asked, exhaustion carved into every line of his face. "We don't have time to wait him out in return. We don't negotiate with him," Ava said. "We work around him." She turned back to the data spread across the command tent's makeshift war room, the captured team's equipment already laid out and cataloged by the base's intelligence specialist. Everything from communication devices to a small weathered notebook found in the wounded man's jacket pocket. Ava picked it up, flipping through pages of what looked at first glance like meaningless shorthand notes. But she had spent years learning to read exactly this kind of thing. "These aren't random notes," she said slowly, her eyes narrowing as patterns began to emerge from what at first looked like chaos. "These are coordinates, encoded, but the structure is consistent with a grid reference system just shifted by a cipher." Ethan leaned over her shoulder, studying the cramped handwriting. "Can you break it?" "Given enough time, yes, but we don't have enough time to do it manually." Ava looked up at Foster. "We need this uploaded to Signals Intelligence, immediately flagged as highest priority. If I'm right, this notebook contains the actual convergence targets across all 3 bases." Foster was already moving, radioing the encoded pages through secure channel to the same intelligence unit that had cracked Briggs's phone records in record time. The wait that followed felt endless, every minute grinding past while the clock on the wall counted down toward a deadline that grew more terrifying the closer it approached. The response came back in just under 3 hours, faster than anyone had dared hope. And when Foster read the decoded results aloud, the tent fell into a silence heavier than anything Ava had experienced since the moment she'd first seen that message about her own acquisition. 3 convergence points. Foster read, his voice tight with controlled tension. Not simultaneous attacks on the bases themselves. Something else. Fuel and ammunition supply depots, one at each location, scheduled to be breached and detonated within a 2-hour window, 46 hours from now. The analysis suggests the intent isn't to overrun the bases militarily. It's to cripple logistics across this entire operational sector simultaneously. Sabotage significant enough to disrupt supply chains for months. "That's not a battle," Ava said slowly, the full scope of it settling into her mind with terrible clarity. "That's an economic and strategic attack designed to look like coordinated insurgent sabotage while actually being run by whoever's paying this network. Which means," Foster said, "the actual force required to execute it doesn't need to be large. It needs to be precise, quiet, and it needs inside access to depots that are normally among the most heavily secured locations on any base." Ava's mind was already racing ahead, calculating, and a cold, sick realization crept up her spine as she considered the pattern one more time. "Foster, who else has depot access here? Who's cleared to move freely near our own fuel and ammunition storage without triggering additional security review?" Foster's face went pale as the question landed. "You think there's another compromised asset here, beyond Briggs and Daniels?" "I think," Ava said, "that this network operates on redundancy. They lost Briggs. They lost Daniels when he ran. A network sophisticated enough to survive both those losses and still be on schedule for a convergence 46 hours from now almost certainly has more than one person inside this wire. The realization sent a fresh wave of urgency through the command tent, and Foster immediately began pulling personnel records, cross-referencing depot access logs against the same patterns that had first exposed Briggs's fuel discrepancies. Ava worked alongside him, her exhaustion pushed down beneath layers of focus and adrenaline scanning names, schedules, anything that might reveal the next thread in this unraveling web. It was Ethan, hours later bleary-eyed but relentless, who found it. "Sergeant Reyes," he said, sliding a printout across the table. "Ammunition Depot night shift supervisor. Look at his access logs over the last month. He's logged entry to the depot 43 times outside his scheduled shift hours. Every single time the stated reason is inventory verification, but there's no corresponding paperwork filed for any of those verifications." Ava studied the log, her pulse quickening with the particular certainty that came when disparate pieces finally clicked into a coherent, damning shape. 43 unauthorized visits with no documentation. That's not sloppy record keeping. That's someone establishing a pattern of access that looks routine enough not to raise flags while actually doing something else entirely. "Setting explosive charges," Foster said grimly, finishing the thought neither of them wanted to voice first. "Slowly, patiently, over weeks, so that by the time the convergence window arrives, the depot's already wired and ready, and all that's needed is a remote trigger." The tent fell into a taut electric silence as the true shape of the threat crystallized before them. This wasn't a battle to be fought with rifles and overwatch positions. This was a bomb likely already built into the very foundation of their own ammunition depot, waiting for a signal that could arrive at any moment within the next 40-some hours. "We need that depot cleared and searched immediately," Ava said, already moving toward the tent flap. "If Reyes realizes we're on to him," Foster warned, following close behind, "he could trigger whatever's in place early out of desperation. We need to move carefully." "There's no version of this where moving slowly is safer," Ava said. "Get EOD to the depot now, quietly, and have someone bring me Reyes's current location. I want eyes on him before he has any idea we've made this connection." Foster relayed the orders through his radio as they moved across the base together, the night air cold and sharp against Ava's face, every sense heightened by the knowledge of how close disaster might be, sitting patient and armed inside a structure that held enough ordnance to level a significant portion of the entire camp. They found Reyes at the depot's night shift station, and something in his posture the moment he saw them approaching, the barely perceptible stiffening of his shoulders, the way his eyes flicked toward the depot's rear access door, before settling back on their faces, told Ava everything she needed to know before a single word was exchanged. "Sergeant Reyes," Foster said, his voice carefully neutral, betraying none of the urgency screaming through every nerve in his body. "We need to conduct a routine safety inspection of the depot. Full walkthrough." "Now?" Reyes asked, and the slight involuntary crack in his voice confirmed everything Ava's instincts had already told her. "It's the middle of the night, Captain. We've got live ordnance in there. Wouldn't it make more sense to schedule this for now?" Ava said, stepping forward, her eyes locked on his with an intensity that made him visibly flinch. "Sergeant Reyes, is there any reason a routine inspection would be a problem for you?" Reyes's hand drifted almost imperceptibly toward his jacket pocket, and Ava's entire body tensed, every instinct screaming that the next few seconds would determine whether this ended peacefully or catastrophically. "Don't," she said quietly, her voice carrying a weight that stopped his hand cold. "Whatever you are reaching for, Sergeant, think very carefully about what happens next if you complete that motion." For a long, suspended moment, Reyes stood frozen, caught between whatever instructions he'd been given and the sudden, undeniable reality of two armed alert officers standing close enough to react to any move he made. Then slowly his shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of him in a way that reminded Ava painfully of Briggs's collapse just days earlier. "It's not what you think," he said, echoing words Ava had heard before from a different man in a different tent, but carrying the same hollow desperation. "Then explain it to me," Ava said. "Because right now what I think is that you've spent the last month wiring this depot to detonate, and if I'm wrong about that, I need you to prove it immediately." Reyes' silence was answer enough. 2 MPS arrived within minutes, and Reyes was secured without further incident, the fight having left him completely the moment his plan collapsed under the weight of Ava's certainty. EOD moved into the depot immediately, and what they found over the following 2 hours confirmed every fear that had been building since Ethan first flagged the access logs. A sophisticated network of charges wired throughout the depot's structure, connected to a remote detonation system designed to be triggered from a significant distance, sophisticated enough that the base's standard security sweeps had never detected it. 40 hours, Foster said, staring at the disarmed device with an expression that mixed profound relief with the sobering understanding of exactly how close this had come to catastrophic failure. If we hadn't found this in the next 40 hours, this depot and everyone within 100 meters of it would have been gone. But we did find it, Ava said, though she allowed herself no real relief because 2 of the 3 convergence points had now been identified and neutralized, but the third at Holloway remained an open, terrifying question mark. The connection with Holloway's command post came through moments later, the young captain's face on the screen tight with a mixture of hope and dread as he waited for whatever update Ava and Foster could provide. "We found our version," Foster told him without preamble. "Depot sabotage sleeper asset inside your ammunition or fuel storage personnel. Check anyone with unusual access patterns, extra hours logged without documentation, particularly focused on inventory tasks that don't correspond to actual paperwork." The captain's expression shifted rapidly from confusion into dawning, horrified recognition. "We have a specialist, Corporal Vance, fuel depot. He's been putting in extra hours for weeks, said he was trying to get ahead on his qualification renewals." He turned away from the camera, barking orders to someone off-screen, his voice sharp with urgency. "Get Vance detained immediately, full search of the fuel depot. Now move." The connection remained open as chaos erupted on the other end. Marines scrambling into motion, the captain's voice cutting through radio chatter with rapid, decisive commands. Ava watched the screen with her heart pounding every second, stretching unbearably as she waited to learn whether they'd caught this third threat in time or whether it had already slipped beyond their reach. Nearly 40 minutes passed before the captain's face returned to the screen, and the visible relief in his expression told Ava everything before he even spoke. "Vance is detained," he said, breathless. "EOD confirmed a device in the fuel depot, similar configuration to what you described. We got it in time." The tent erupted into a wave of exhausted, disbelieving relief. Foster sinking into a chair with his hands over his face, Ethan letting out a shaky breath he'd apparently been holding for several minutes. But Ava remained standing, her mind still racing, because 3 convergence points neutralized didn't mean the threat was over. It meant the network's physical infrastructure had been dismantled. It didn't mean the people behind it had been caught, and until the man Briggs had called Marcus, and whoever stood above him, were identified and stopped, this entire operation could simply regroup and try again somewhere else sometime later, with lessons learned from every mistake that had led to tonight's failures. "This isn't over," she said quietly, cutting through the relief settling over the room. Foster looked up at her, exhaustion and confusion warring in his expression. "Ava, we just stopped 3 coordinated sabotage attacks in less than 48 hours. That's a victory by any measure." "It's a victory against the symptoms," Ava said, "not against the disease. Somewhere out there, Marcus and whoever he answers to are about to learn that their entire convergence operation just collapsed. People that patient, that resourced, don't simply give up and disappear. They adapt. They rebuild. And unless we can identify who's actually running this network, we've bought time, not safety." The tent fell quiet as the weight of her words settled over everyone present, the exhausted euphoria of the moment tempered by the grim recognition that she was right. "So what do we do?" Ethan asked. "We've got Briggs's information. We've got the 2 captured extraction team members. We've got Reyes and now Vance. Surely somewhere in all of that, there's a way to trace this back to its source." Ava turned to the captured extraction operator's file, the man who had remained silent through hours of interrogation, and something clicked into place in her mind, a strategy she hadn't fully considered until this exact moment. "Maybe not through interrogation," she said slowly, "but through something else. The message that ordered my acquisition specifically mentioned an extraction team already inbound. That means there's a command structure actively monitoring this operation in something close to real time. If we can identify the communication channel they're using to coordinate across all 3 convergence points, and we feed them false information suggesting the operation succeeded, you want to bait them into revealing themselves," Foster said, understanding dawning in his voice. I want to give Marcus, or whoever's above him, a reason to communicate directly urgently in a way that might expose their actual location or identity, Ava said. Right now, they believe their operation is still in motion. The moment they learn all three convergence points failed and their extraction attempt failed, they're going to need to communicate with someone about what comes next. That communication is our best chance to trace this back to its actual source. Foster considered this for a long moment before nodding slowly. I'll need to run this up the chain, get authorization for a deception operation of this scale. But if command approves it, how do we execute it? Ava's eyes moved to the recovered communication equipment sitting on the table beside them, the devices taken from the captured extraction team and from Reyes and Vance both. We use their own channels against them. Send confirmation through Reyes's or Vance's communication method that the depot sabotage succeeded as planned. Let them believe the convergence worked. Watch what happens next. The plan required careful coordination across all three bases, painstaking work to craft messages that would pass as authentic without triggering suspicion. Technical specialists working alongside Ava late into the night to replicate exactly the tone and structure of the compromised asset's previous communications. It was delicate, dangerous work because a single misstep, a single phrase that didn't quite match the established pattern, could alert the network that they were being manipulated rather than genuinely informed. 29 hours remained on the original convergence countdown when the false confirmation messages went out simultaneously from all three bases, each one crafted to suggest that their respective sabotage operations had succeeded exactly as planned, each one waiting to see what response, if any, would come back through the network's command structure. The wait that followed was in some ways more agonizing than anything Ava had experienced since arriving on this base. There was no immediate action to take, no threat to neutralize with a well-placed shot, no perimeter to defend. There was only the terrible grinding patience of waiting to see whether a carefully constructed lie would draw a predator out of hiding. Ava spent those hours in the command tent unable to sleep, despite Ethan's continued gentle insistence that she needed rest, her mind cycling endlessly through every possible response the network might make, every contingency she needed to be ready for. It was Ethan sitting beside her through the long hours of waiting who finally broke through the tension with a question that had nothing to do with the operation at all. When this is over, he said quietly, whatever happens with Marcus with this whole network, what happens to you? Do you go back to whatever you were doing before you got assigned here? Ava considered the question and surprised by how much it required her to think about a future she hadn't allowed herself to imagine since her arrival. I don't know, she admitted. I've spent so long focused on the next mission, the next threat, that I stopped thinking much about what comes after. I'm not sure I know how to exist without something like this to focus on. That sounds lonely, Ethan said gently. It is, Ava said, and the simple honesty of the admission surprised even her. But it's also familiar. Sometimes familiar and safe feel like the same thing even when they're not. Ethan was quiet for a moment, studying her with an expression that carried more warmth than she'd allowed herself to notice from anyone in a very long time. For what it's worth, I don't think you have to choose between the mission and having something someone worth existing for beyond it. I think you deserve both. Before Ava could formulate a response to that one that might have required examining feelings she'd kept carefully locked away for reasons that had nothing to do with this current crisis. The communication terminal across the tent erupted with an alert that snapped both of them immediately back into focus. We have a response, the signal specialist called out, his voice tight with urgency. Encrypted transmission originating from a fixed location, this time not the mobile pattern we saw before. They stayed in one place long enough for us to get a partial triangulation. Foster was at the terminal within seconds, Ava right behind him, both of them reading the intercepted message as it scrolled across the screen. Confirmation received. Convergence successful across all three targets. Proceed with Phase 3 payment structure. Coordinates for final settlement to follow. Phase 3, Ava repeated. There's more beyond the convergence. The triangulation, Foster said urgently, turning to the signal specialist. How precise? Narrowed to a compound approximately 30 kilometers south of our position, just across the regional border. Civilian registration, but flagged in previous intelligence sweeps as a suspected logistics hub for smuggling operations. The pieces clicked together in Ava's mind with terrible, satisfying clarity. This whole network wasn't ideological. It was never about insurgency or territory. It's a criminal enterprise using sabotage as leverage or as a service for hire, and someone at that compound is the actual client or the actual controller waiting for confirmation before releasing payment. Foster was already reaching for the secure line to command, relaying the triangulated coordinates with the same urgency that had defined every hour of this exhausting, harrowing operation. We need authorization for a strike team immediately before they realize the convergence confirmation was false and go dark. The response from command came faster than Ava had dared hope, a combined strike force already being coordinated from a nearby forward staging area. Helicopters spinning up within the hour. Every piece of intelligence gathered across the past several days feeding into a single decisive operation aimed at the compound, believed to house the network's operational leadership. "You're coming," Foster said to Ava, not quite a question, as he checked his own gear with quick, efficient movements. "Try to stop me," Ava said, already moving toward her rifle case. The flight to the compound felt endless, despite lasting barely 20 minutes. The helicopter cutting low and fast across terrain. Ava had spent days studying on maps, but had never seen with her own eyes the tension inside the aircraft, thick enough that conversation felt unnecessary. Everyone locked into the particular silence that precedes violence. Nobody wants, but everyone understands is coming. The compound came into view exactly where the triangulation had suggested, a cluster of buildings that looked from above almost mundane, the kind of unremarkable structure that could hide in plain sight for months or years without drawing serious scrutiny. Exactly the kind of location a sophisticated criminal network would choose, specifically because it looked like nothing worth noticing. The strike team moved with practiced, brutal efficiency, breaching the compound's outer perimeter within minutes of touching down, and Ava moved with them, not in the primary assault element, but positioned for overwatch, her rifle trained on the compound's rooftops and windows, watching for exactly the kind of threat she'd spent her entire career learning to anticipate. Gunfire erupted almost immediately as the strike team encountered resistance, though nothing close to the organized, disciplined defense Ava had expected from a network this sophisticated. These were guards competent, but clearly unprepared for a full military strike force descending on their location with overwhelming force and complete surprise. Through her scope, Ava caught movement on the compound's second floor, a figure moving with purpose toward what looked like a communications room, clearly attempting to destroy evidence or alert someone before the strike team could reach him. She adjusted, tracking the movement, but held her fire, some instinct telling her this figure needed to be captured, not eliminated. "Second floor east side," she called into her radio. "Possible high-value target attempting to reach communications equipment. Requesting team redirect." The strike team adjusted their approach, immediately cutting through the compound's interior with speed that left the scattered resistance no time to regroup. And within minutes, Ava heard the confirmation crackle through her radio that the second-floor target had been captured alive. She made her way into the compound once the area had been declared secure, moving through rooms that told the story of an operation far more extensive than anything she'd fully anticipated. Computer equipment, financial records, communication logs spanning months of coordinated sabotage across a region far wider than the 3 bases they had already identified. The captured man sat in what had clearly been his private office, hands zip-tied, his face a mask of controlled fury and disbelief, and something in his bearing, his careful, measured stillness, even under capture, told Ava this was finally the man Briggs had called Marcus. "You're the one who's been running this," Ava said, stepping into the room. The man looked up at her, and recognition flickered across his features, something almost like grim admiration mixed with undisguised hatred. "Mitchell," he said, his accent carrying the careful precision Briggs had described. "I underestimated you. That was a mistake I don't often make." "You tried to have me killed," Ava said. "Then you tried to have me taken. Both times you underestimated exactly what you were dealing with." "So it seems," Marcus said, something almost like bitter respect in his voice. "For what it's worth, the offer that led to your attempted acquisition was genuine. Someone with your particular talents would have been extraordinarily valuable to our operation had you been willing." "I was never going to be willing," Ava said flatly. "And now every operation you've built across this region is finished. Every sleeper asset you recruited, every network you established. All of it exposed, all of it dismantled, all because you decided a woman you couldn't intimidate into quitting was worth escalating an entire timeline over." Marcus's jaw tightened, the first genuine crack in his composed exterior. This is one compound, one operation. You believe this is the end of something larger than you can imagine. Maybe, Ava said, but it's the end of your part in it, and every piece of intelligence in this building is about to be turned over to people who will spend the next several years pulling apart every connection you've ever made. That's not nothing, Marcus. That's everything you spent years building gone because of one demonstration you couldn't resist making. She left him there for the intelligence teams to process, walking back out into the compound's central courtyard, where Foster stood coordinating the final sweep, the sun beginning to rise over the distant hills, painting the sky in colors that felt for the first time in days like they might actually herald something better than what had come before. "We got him," Foster said, disbelief and exhaustion mixing in his voice. "Truly got him." "We got the head of this particular snake," Ava said. "There's probably a body it was attached to that we still haven't found. But this is a start, a real one." The following days passed in a blur of debriefings, intelligence processing, and the slow methodical work of confirming exactly how deep this network's reach had extended. Briggs, in a final act of cooperation that would ultimately factor into his sentencing, provided additional testimony that helped intelligence analysts connect Marcus's compound to operations across an even wider swath of the region than initially suspected. Reyes and Vance, along with the surviving members of the extraction team, offered fragments of information that, pieced together, painted a picture of an organization that had operated with impunity for years before a single sniper's instincts had finally begun unraveling it thread by thread. Ava found herself in the quiet aftermath, standing once more at the edge of the base's perimeter fence, staring out at the same tree line she'd studied so carefully on her very first morning. Here, when she'd been nothing more to most of these Marines than an unwelcome curiosity, a woman they assumed didn't belong. Ethan found her there, as he so often had, over these past intense transformative days, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, simply standing together in the comfortable silence that had grown between them since that very first awkward conversation in the supply tent. "Command's already talking about reassignment," Ethan said finally. "For you. Given everything that happened here, they're saying there are other networks, other regions that could use someone with your particular skill set." Ava considered this feeling the familiar pull of duty, of purpose, of the mission that had defined so much of her identity for longer than she could easily remember. "Probably," she said. "Do you want to go?" Ava turned to look at him. Really look at him, taking in the quiet steadiness that had never once wavered since the day she'd arrived. The kindness he'd shown her when almost no one else on this base had bothered to look past their assumptions. The simple, unwavering decency that had made him, without either of them fully acknowledging it, until now the one person she trusted completely. "I want," she said slowly, "to figure out what it means to want something beyond the next mission. I haven't let myself do that in longer than I can remember. But I think for the first time in a very long time, I might actually be ready to try." Ethan smiled, something warm and hopeful breaking through the exhaustion that had defined his face for days. "That sounds like a good place to start." Behind them, the base continued its slow return to something resembling normal rhythm, Marines going about their duties with a new quiet respect toward the woman who had arrived on a helicopter, looking like she didn't belong, and had in the span of little more than a week uncovered a betrayal within their own ranks, survived an assassination attempt, prevented an acquisition, and helped dismantle a criminal network that had been operating in the shadows of this region for years before anyone had thought to look closely enough to see it. Captain Foster, watching from a distance as Ava and Ethan stood together at the perimeter fence, found himself thinking back to the file he'd first read before her arrival. The redacted lines, the gaps in her service record that had once seemed like warning signs, and now felt like the quiet architecture of someone who had spent years sacrificing everything ordinary about her life in service of missions most people would never know existed. She had walked into this base as a stranger, mocked and dismissed by men who judged her before they'd ever seen what she was capable of, and she was leaving it whenever that day finally came as something closer to a legend whispered about in mess tents and command briefings across a region that would spend years untangling the full scope of what her instincts had uncovered. Somewhere far from that quiet wind-scoured base and offices and briefing rooms she would likely never see, intelligence analysts continued the painstaking work of following every thread Marcus's compound had revealed, tracing connections that stretched into networks larger and more dangerous than any single person could have fully anticipated. Briggs would face his court-martial, his testimony weighed against the genuine remorse he'd shown in his final days of cooperation. A man forever marked by the choice he'd made and the price it had cost in blood he could never fully repay. Reyes and Vance would face their own reckonings, their own attempts to explain choices that had nearly cost dozens of lives across 3 separate bases. And Marcus, wherever his interrogation ultimately led, would spend the rest of his days understanding in ways he'd never anticipated. That underestimating a quiet woman with a rifle case had been the single greatest miscalculation of his entire criminal career. But for Ava Mitchell, standing at the edge of a base that had once ridiculed her and now revered her, the ending of this particular story carried a different weight than simple victory. She had come to this remote, forgotten corner of the world carrying nothing but silence, discipline, and years of unspoken loss, expecting nothing more than another deployment among men who would judge her before they knew her. Instead, she had found something she hadn't realized she was still capable of finding: purpose that extended beyond the next mission, respect earned through action rather than demanded through rank, and in Ethan Brooks, a connection that reminded her after so many years of solitary discipline that she was allowed to be more than a weapon aimed at the next threat. She had arrived as a woman the Marines refused to respect, and she was leaving as the operator who had seen a hidden war that no one else could see, fought it with a precision that silenced every doubter, and won it before most of them ever understood it had begun. 5 targets had dropped that day on the ridge without warning, and in the days that followed, an entire network of betrayal, sabotage, and criminal ambition had collapsed in their wake, undone by the same quiet, watchful patience that had once been mistaken for weakness, and would never by anyone who had witnessed what came next be mistaken for that again. The war Ava Mitchell came to finish was never the one written on any official briefing. It was the one hiding in plain sight, inside trust, inside silence, inside the men who had judged her worth before they had ever seen what she carried. And in the end, she did not just survive that war. She ended it standing taller in her stillness than every voice that had once tried to make her small, and that more than any medal or record or mission report was the truest measure of who Sergeant Ava Mitchell had always been.